Withdrawal Act to constitute a meaningful vote under the terms of that Act. I give way to my...
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, and he may know what I'm going to ask, because I asked the Prime Minister and she suggested I ask him. And I do this on the basis of someone who he knows voted to support the agreement last time and will vote to do so again. But it is an important issue, and that's this. My honourable friend has just said that the government will facilitate the discussion of alternative arrangements should the deal not, for whatever reason, succeed in the 2 weeks following the European Council. Well, we are already eating into the 2 weeks following the European Council, and my right honourable friend urges us to resist, for various reasons, which I can understand to some degree, the so-called Letwin amendments, but he has not yet come forward with a timetable as to when the government will bring forward its own means of facilitation and the terms. Can I ask him what I asked the Prime Minister? When?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. As I said a moment ago, these discussions with other parties and members across the House will continue, but I can confirm to the House today that the Government would seek to provide government time in order for this process to proceed. If the amendment in the name of my right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset, does not pass tonight, we would set aside time to have a first day's debate later this week, and after that day's debate had been concluded, we would then consider and consult about what, if any, further time might be needed. Now, if on the other hand my right honourable friend's amendment is carried, then the consequence of that, in terms of control of the order paper, means that those decisions would be very much a matter for my right honourable friend and the House more generally, given the terms in which that amendment has been drafted. I'm going to give way to my honourable friend, the honourable gentleman for Oldham, and then my honourable friend.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. Can he confirm that there will be free votes on this side of the House if that situation occurs?
Well, I think it's premature to say anything at this stage about whipping, because at the moment we don't know exactly what the content of any options might be, nor what amendments might conceivably be tabled to those, nor which of those amendments the Chair might be willing to accept. But I know that my right honourable friend, the Chief Whip, will have heard my honourable friend's representations. Give way to the member for Oldham and then to...
Can I thank him for giving way? The reason why the Prime Minister's statement last Wednesday was so disappointing, and we'll hear it today actually, it's not about the 17 million any more than it is the 16 million. It's about everybody who lives in this country, who has a stake in its future. And people are looking at what's happening in absolute frustration and despair, that those people who they've elected to make decisions and make this work have not found a way through this. Now, we have an opportunity with the indicative votes that are coming to really make a breakthrough and find some common ground, but it would require the Prime Minister to depart from the red lines and learn to compromise. What advice would he offer to the Prime Minister in this circumstance?
I'm afraid one thing I'm very clear about indeed is that I will offer, I'm very willing to offer and do offer advice to my right honourable friend, but I talk about that advice to her in private and not in the House more generally. Give way to honourable friend.
I'd like to thank my right honourable friend for giving way. Many of my constituents are emailing me asking me to vote for Amendment A tonight. Can my right honourable friend confirm that even if that amendment does not go through, the government will make time for indicative votes? If we haven't passed the withdrawal agreement, the government will make time for indicative votes, and will those votes happen this week or next week?
As I said a moment ago, if Amendment A does not pass, then we will make available a first day this week for the process to which we have committed ourselves to proceed. It may be that other time is needed, but that would be a matter for consideration after the first day had been concluded. I will give way to the honourable lady, then to the right honourable lady, then I hope the House will forgive you. I am going to try and move on.
The honourable gentleman is very generous in giving way. If the Amendment A is voted down and the government does indeed come forward with proposing its own slot. Will the government determine the options this House votes on, or will MPs?
I think that the Honourable Lady was preempting my next paragraph, because what I was about to say is that we do not think that it is for the government to tell the House what options it should and should not consider. That should be a matter for the House. But that in turn does not mean that the government is going to be silent about the options that might be debated. We will certainly continue to be strong advocates for the deal we've negotiated, and we will continue to urge members from all sides to be realistic. Give way to the Right Honourable Lady.
Well, again, Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable Gentleman is incredibly generous with his time. Can he help us, though, with this? Is it the government's plan that those votes will relate to the withdrawal agreement, or will they only deal with the political declaration? Because, as he knows, there is a profound difference between the two. The former, the withdrawal agreement, will go into, if it passes, into treaty, into law and so on, as international law, but the political declaration is non-binding.
If the Right Honourable Lady will bear with me, I want to come to that in a second. I will give way to my Right Honourable learned friend one last time.
But before he moves back to that point, I'm very grateful. My honourable friend has said that the government's going to reject, or try to reject, the so-called Letwin amendment this evening, but then will make time available for roughly the same thing in government time. So, as far as I can see, the only objection to the amendment we have today is it's been tabled by a backbencher and not by the government. Wouldn't this all be resolved if he would confirm that the government will make this Wednesday available for this purpose, because we don't have much time, and then it seems to me we'd all be in total agreement to be able to proceed to the indicative votes.
Mr. Speaker, until we have had the division this evening, assuming there is one on my Right Honourable friend's amendment, we won't know whether Wednesday is available for the government's disposal, or whether that is something that will fall to other means of consideration. Mr. Speaker, I'll give way to the Honourable Member for Ilford Town, my Honourable friend Member for Falmouth and Truro, and then I am going to make some progress.
I am genuinely grateful that he's given way, but this is genuinely hopeless. He can't, Mr. Speaker, argue against a perfectly sensible and reasonable in the circumstances amendment in the name of the Right Honourable Member for West Dorset on the basis that the government is going to propose something similar, without at this stage saying on what day, for how long, on what conditions, on what range of motions. You know, if he is saying that Parliament shouldn't be in control because the government ought to be in control, then surely it's reasonable to expect the government to actually be in control, to have some sense of what the process is, and to give some clarity now. Otherwise, we may as well troop through to vote for the Right Honourable Member's amendment.
Mr. Speaker, there is a matter of constitutional principle here. What the government is saying is that it is for the government, as is normal, to control the order paper, but in this case we would devote that time to consideration of those measures that the House wanted to see debated and decided. I give way to my honourable friends, and then I have an obligation to give way to my right honourable friend afterwards.
I'm very, very grateful, and my right honourable friend is being incredibly generous and gracious. Is it not the case that it's common practice in a debate for sometimes the government to actually welcome an amendment posed by members of the backbench or the opposition parties? And given, from what I have heard, the Right Honourable Gentleman has said he is actually going to do on Wednesday exactly what Amendment A says, wouldn't the easiest thing to do just be accept Amendment A tonight?
I think the difference between us, between myself and my other friend, Mr. Speaker, on this occasion is that I do take the view, and the government takes the view, that the amendment that is before us, Amendment A, would upset the balance between legislature and executive in a way that would set an unwelcome precedent. And it's for that reason that we are not supporting this amendment. Now, I'm going to give way, as I said I would do, to my right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset.
Just before the... Yes, honourable gentleman. Point of order, Sir William Cash.
I'd be grateful for your guidance on this whole question of Standing Order 14, given the fact that we operate a system of parliamentary government, not government by Parliament, and it's for a good reason, which is, in a nutshell, the fact that government takes precedence under Standing Order 14 in its business because it is the wish of the members of Parliament by a majority of the government which forms the government, and therefore the wishes of the electorate are at stake. I just ask you if you would be kind enough to refer to that. Just answer my question, if you might, please, Mr. Speaker, because I regard this as a matter of fundamental constitutional importance.
Pipe down and listen.
Well, and I very much look forward to listening to the speech that the honourable gentleman might make in the course of the debate, and he knows that he can always look to me and very much expect to catch my eye. So far as the standing order is concerned, the fact of its presence is well known to everybody, but the House is the owner of the standing orders, and if a proposition is put to the House for a change in those arrangements, including in a particular case the suspension of a standing order or more than one standing order, it is perfectly credible and reasonable that that should be put to the House. And I did, after all, announce my selection and provisional selection of amendments earlier, and I don't think, although I accept that he objects to this amendment, it came as any great surprise that the cross-party amendment in the name of the right honourable gentleman for West Dorset was selected. As to whether it is acceptable to the House, that does remain to be seen. It's obviously not acceptable to the honourable gentleman, and we will hear further and better particulars of his objection in due course.
Mr. Speaker, I give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm really very grateful to my right honourable friend, and I promised him I wasn't intending to intervene in his speech, unlike almost everybody else sitting in the chamber today. But he does force me to do so, because I wonder whether he could clarify a slightly different point. Given that his objection to our amendment is ostensibly simply the constitutional one, and given that that could be entirely resolved by the government accepting the amendment, or indeed could have been resolved on Thursday or Friday when it was tabled by the government signing it and turning it into a government amendment, in that case a government minister would have been at the top of the list, given all of that, could he simply tell us whether on the Wednesday, if our amendment fails, the government intends to operate exactly the same principles as are contained within that amendment, or whether the government has some other plan about how to construct the day?
Minister. I can't give a commitment immediately for that, of that level of detail, but I will have further discussions, and it may be that my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, will be able to respond to that point in greater detail when in his wind-up speech. Mr. Speaker, look, Mr. Speaker, can I say this? I mean, I'm always over-tempted to give way to interventions. I am deeply conscious that on the last two occasions I came to this dispatch box, I was speaking for over an hour in total because of the number of interventions that I permitted. So I am going to try to make some progress, because I'm sure many right honourable members on all sides of the House do actually want to catch your eye and contribute themselves to the debate. Now, whatever options are put forward, and this starts to address the issue raised by the right honourable lady, the member for Broxtowe, whatever options are put forward, they will need to be negotiable with the European Union. Yeah. And in particular, any deal will require the withdrawal agreement that not only we, but the 27 other governments of the European Union member states have negotiated. The conclusions of the European Council last week could not have been clearer that they are not prepared to consider any reopening of the terms of the withdrawal agreement that for them, as well as for us, represented the outcome of a lengthy period of negotiation and compromise on both sides. And this is one of the reasons why my right honourable friend was clear earlier this afternoon that the government cannot simply pre-commit to accepting whatever might come out of this process. It is entirely possible that this House could vote for something that is neither realistic nor negotiable. For example, it could vote to seek further changes to the withdrawal agreement, which the EU has been clear is simply not going to be possible. Equally, the House could vote to maintain all the benefits of the single market without agreeing to the obligations that, such as alignment with state aid rules or free movement of people, while the EU has been clear that the four freedoms are indivisible. But of course, we will engage constructively with members across the House on whatever the outcome of this process is. And we continue to believe, though, that the amendment in the name of my right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset, would be an unwelcome precedent to set, that it would overturn the balance between Parliament and Government. In the event that his amendment were carried tonight, then obviously we would want to have a dialogue with him and his co-sponsors about how he proposed to take those measures forward. Now, in addition, no, I'm not going to give way further, Mr. Speaker. Now, I want to say a few words to add to those of the Prime Minister about the statutory instrument that has been published today about the extension of Article 50. Because now that the United Kingdom and the European Union have agreed an extension to Article 50, and that has been embodied in a legal decision of the European Council, the date needs to be amended to reflect in our domestic law the new point at which the EU treaties will cease to apply in the United Kingdom. The Government has therefore laid today a draft statutory instrument under the EU Withdrawal Act that provides for both of the possible extensions, the 12th of March and the 22nd of May. This will be subject to the draft affirmative procedure. Did I misspeak March? I think I meant April. This will be subject to the draft affirmative procedure so that it will be debated in each House, and it must come into force by 11 p.m. on the 29th of March. And the purpose of this is to make sure that our own statute book reflects the extension of Article 50, which is legally binding in international law. Without this instrument, there would be a clash in domestic law because contrary provisions would apply both EU rules and new domestic rules simultaneously.
Given, as I said earlier to the Prime Minister, given the fact that the commencement order itself has not yet been brought into force, could my right honourable friend give me the lawful authority whereby the decision that was endorsed by the authority of Sir Tim Barrow was consistent with the vires of the original enactment under the Withdrawal Act itself in 2018, Section 1?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I will try to give my honourable friend a brief answer now, and I think probably the best thing then is for me to, or my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, to write formally and swiftly to him in his capacity as chair of the European Scrutiny Committee, so that he has that set out. Well, no, Mr. Speaker, I'm not giving away, because I do actually want to try and give my honourable friend the short answer that I promised a second ago. The purpose of the SI is to reflect the extension agreed between the United Kingdom and the European Union. And the Government will now, therefore, delay the commencement of the repeal of the European Communities Act. A commencement order is required under Section 25(4) of the EU Withdrawal Act in order to give effect to this repeal. The timing of that commencement order will depend upon the date that we leave the European Union. And as a matter of both EU and international law, The effect of the European Council decision is that we are not leaving the European Union on the 29th of March. Therefore, it would be wrong to commit the resolutions that were passed by this House the House did not want to leave on the 29th of March without a deal, and the House explicitly voted in favour of the government seeking an extension to Article 50. Mr. Speaker, no, I'm going to make some progress. I'm going to speak.
Point of order, Kate Hoey.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker. I wonder, could you rule what the position would be then, constitutionally, if this statutory instrument, when it comes before us, changing the date which we've already in our legislation, was not accepted by this House? Does EU law overrule our Parliament?
As a matter of general practice, it is well established that EU law trumps UK national law. I'm not saying anything controversial there. As to the particular circumstances here, the answer is that I might well pronounce upon it, but I would be extremely foolish to do so off the top of my head, and therefore I may be able to sate the curiosity of the Honourable Lady, which will be widely shared across the House, but I'm afraid it's not within my gift to do so now. Better to give a valid and informative answer later than an invalid, uninformative and potentially misleading answer now. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, without the instrument there would be a clash in domestic law because contradictory provisions would apply both EU rules and new domestic rules simultaneously. It is therefore important that the instrument is approved by Parliament so that we can ensure that our statute book accurately reflects the fact that the UK will now remain a member state until at least 11 p.m. on the 12th of April. Now, if I can turn, Mr. Speaker, briefly to the amendments that you have selected, other than Amendment A, which I think we have already debated at some length, and if I can turn, therefore, to Amendments D and F. On Amendment D, as I said earlier, the Prime Minister and I have had some constructive meetings with honourable members from the main opposition party in recent days, and the Prime Minister met the Leader of the Opposition earlier this afternoon. And on that basis, I would say to the right honourable gentleman opposite that the amendment is not necessary. But I'd also say this, that the official opposition's amendment demonstrates one thing very clearly, which is that none of the changes that amendment seeks to secure are changes to the withdrawal agreement. And the inference I draw from that is that the official opposition now actually supports the withdrawal agreement, and I hope that when the right honourable gentleman comes to speak, he will be able to confirm that he and his party accept that all possible deals with the European Union include this withdrawal agreement, and that indeed that is the clear will of the European Council also. Now, I understand completely the motive behind Amendment F in the name of the Right Honourable Lady, the Member for Derby South. It instructs the Government to report by the 9th of April about how we would ensure that the United Kingdom did not leave without a deal if the deal had not been approved by that point. And consistently through this process, the Government has accepted that we will need to come back to this dispatch box in the circumstances that the House had not supported a withdrawal agreement by the end of this week. And I recognise that the House has also now voted twice against leaving the European Union without a deal. But I do have to say to the Right Honourable Lady and her co-sponsors that there are only two honourable member for Perth and North Perthshire earlier of a revocation of Article 50. But of course that is not a temporary measure. It is not a mere stay in exit proceedings. The Court of Justice of the European Union has made it very clear that revocation would have to be both permanent and a decision taken in good faith. Or, is it what? Or, Mr. Speaker, we could ask for a long extension. But that would mean running elections to the European Parliament nearly 3 years after the vote of the British public to leave. And of course it would also rely on the EU agreeing to such a long extension, which would by no means be assured. And unless the House were prepared to support one of those two options, and whatever the Right Honourable Lady might wish, the legal default under European law would be that the treaties would cease to apply and we would have to leave without a deal. So the way forward is for the House to accept the deal, and in particular this week to approve the withdrawal agreement to secure the extension to the 22nd of May. Mr. Speaker, if Parliament comes together and backs the Brexit deal, we will leave the European Union by the 22nd of May. We can then end 3 years of divisive debate and uncertainty and allow the country to move on towards a new future outside the European Union and devote ourselves to the important work of negotiating that deep and special partnership with our European friends and neighbours, which this party promised in its election manifesto. The government will make every effort to ensure that we are able to leave with a deal and move our country forward, and to allow those who voted leave and those who voted remain to come together in looking to the future. And it is in that spirit that I commend this motion to the House.
Yeah. Question is as on the order paper. Sir Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister's got herself and the government into a hopeless position. Having disregarded views from across this House for the best part of 2 years, the government now finds itself with a deal it just can't get through this House, and time has almost run out. And today we see that they sort of agree with the initiative to break the impasse, but don't agree with it also. And it has to be seen in this context. The Prime Minister's lost control of the meaningful vote. In truth, we've got no idea when or if it's going to be put again, or whether it's winnable. I listened carefully to what the Prime Minister said this afternoon. She said she gauged there still was not sufficient support for the deal, but she'd continue discussions so that she could bring forward a vote this week. Mr. Speaker, we've been in that loop since the 10th of December. Since the 10th of December. I don't think there's enough support. I'm going to have further discussions and I'm going to put the vote again. She's lost control of that process. She's also lost control of the negotiations. That much is clear from the EU Council's decision last Thursday. When the question was put to the government, what happens if a meaningful vote fails, there was no answer. And that created a real anxiety that we could crash out this Friday without a deal. And it was in those circumstances that the EU acted as it did in putting forward the dates of the 12th of April and 22nd of May. But it was a loss of control by the government in the very negotiations. The Prime Minister also appears to have lost control of her party. There have been too many jokes already about whether the Right Honourable Member, gentleman, is the Deputy Prime Minister or the putative Prime Minister. I won't repeat them, I'll scratch them from my speech. But it is quite clear that control of the party is gone. And tonight, Mr. Speaker, I think it is likely that the Prime Minister and the Government are going to lose control of Parliament and of the process in circumstances where, arguably, they don't need to if they'd acted only last week. Because the sense that we've got to move forward has been here. It was in the debate last week. It's not new today. It was clear, I think, that many members of this House want to find a way forward and want to break the impasse, feel a duty to break the deadlock. That was the subject matter of last week's debate. And so instead of a constructive discussion about how we do it, we will divide probably on this motion this moment. I heard the cry before me first, so I will give way.
I'm extremely grateful. And on that point about trying to break the impasse, the manifesto of the Conservative Party has been cited. But isn't it the case that manifestos, in order to be implementable, need to win a mandate. And the Conservative Party did not win a mandate at the last general election, because a mandate would mean having an overall majority in this House. And doesn't that provide, contrary to what the Brexit Secretary said, the room for the government to be able to be more flexible on this matter?
I'm grateful for that and agree with the sentiment. And I have stood here and been very critical about the red lines that the Prime Minister put in place at the beginning of the process, and I've always seen them as the cause of the problem. But today isn't really about the inquisition into that, although there will have to be that. It's actually about a different question, which is, can we find a way forward? And I honestly think that many members across this House want to find a way forward and have been working to that end. I will give way.
I thank the honourable noble gentleman for giving way. The Prime Minister was rightly questioned earlier by members of our benches to say that if the House were to come together on indicative votes and find a way forward, would she honour it and be bound by it? The Prime Minister was unwilling to say that she would. Could I inquire then, if this House comes forward and finds a majority for a deal that is different from that of the Labour Party policy, would we be bound by it and would we be whipping in favour of it?
Well, I listened carefully to what the Prime Minister said, and I am going to say something about that in a minute. I think what she was saying is that she wouldn't say in advance whether she would be bound, and we need to probe that because that's an important question. But we're getting slightly ahead of ourselves. I think the process that is envisaged is the process that, in the first instance, simply tests where there is a majority. It's actually looking at different propositions and seeing whether there is a majority in the House. And we need to get to that stage. I will give way.
I'm most grateful. I'm sure that the honourable gentleman understands that although the amendment in question, Amendment A, is in the name of the member for West Dorset, in reality there are only about 14 or 15 Conservatives, maybe slightly less, on that amendment. Therefore, to all intents and purposes, it is the numbers on the opposition benches which would carry it if it did. How does he answer the charge that this is inconsistent with our constitutional accountable government understanding Order 14? And how does he answer the question that the attempt to do this would effectively seek to reverse the referendum result and also the Withdrawal Act itself?
Well, I honestly can't see how exploring whether there's a majority for a different approach is inconsistent with anything we've done so far. It's actually what we should have done 2 years ago. It's what we should have done 2 years ago. Because the referendum answered just one question, which is whether more people would rather be in or out of the EU. It didn't answer the next question, huge question, which is, if out, what sort of future relationship? That required very serious and considered discussion, and really needed a discussion in this House to see if we could reach agreement. I will give way, and then I'll give way behind me. Yeah.
The honourable gentleman a moment ago asked a very serious question about whether the Labour Party would regard itself as bound to give support to any majority that emerges, the same question that we were putting to the government. The whole thing is pointless if the Labour Party is going to whip on all these indicative votes, and then if a majority emerges, is going to whip against that if it's not consistent with its manifesto, which also did not get the majority support of the public at the last election. We resolved all this in 1972, and I apologise, I don't normally go back into the depths of history, by having free votes on each side, because it would have been fatuous for the front bench to try to go in this process. So, will the Labour Party have free votes, and will the Labour Party be bound by what other majorities might emerge from the indicative voting?
If this passes tonight, there will be an intense discussion about how the process takes place and what the options are. When we see those options, we, the Labour Party, will take decisions about how to... Well, just let me complete this. Just let me complete this point. If one of the options is no deal, we'll whip against it. Of course we'll whip against it, and if that's the outcome, we'll reject it. So of course we need to see the options. Yes.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way, and I'm glad to hear him say that the Labour Party will whip against no deal, because these are my constituents' jobs that we are talking about here. But can I ask my honourable friend if he agrees with me that these questions about the Constitution are not new, because, Mr Speaker, by definition, under our Constitution, the thing that wins votes in this House is the government. So it was hardly backbenchers who broke that convention under our Constitution.
Well, I'm grateful for that intervention, and I agree. And in a sense, we're only in this place because there's no other way to break the deadlock or the impasse. I will give way, and then I'm going to make some progress.
I thank my right honourable and learned friend for giving way. Does he agree with me that if the Prime Minister had not tried to exclude Parliament completely from having a say and had to be dragged kicking and screaming by the Supreme Court to allow us to legislate on triggering Article 50, if she had had a proper cross-party process and a national debate with a green paper and a proper white paper, instead of springing things on this House already decided at the last possible minute, then there would be considerably more goodwill for her in this place, and there'd be a chance for us to have done what should have been done to get the Withdrawal Act and the deal through Parliament, because it would have been done properly. And now we are scrambling at the last possible minute simply because she has not done the job properly.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And it is a matter of record that the Prime Minister did not want to vote even on triggering Article 50. And we only get a vote on that because of a Supreme Court decision. The Prime Minister didn't want a meaningful vote. We only got that in the teeth of the government whipping against it because we won a vote. It is true that the government has whipped strongly against any amendments about objectives, every time, including one in the summer, where it was a very controversial whipping exercise that threw up a debate about maternity leave. So the idea that the government's been genuinely open to a debate about this and willing to listen to where the House is just not true. And it is a... we really, really ought to have gone through this exercise 2 years ago. But I do understand the argument now that we are where we are, and we've now got to find a way forward, which is why we support this motion. I will just make some progress, and I will give way again in just a moment. But as we go, if we're to find a way forward, I think we need to be clear about what we're not prepared to do. And there's no way forward that includes blaming members of this House for the mess that we're in. There's no way forward that can include whipping up a sense of people versus MPs. There's no way forward based on the notion that members of this House who've persistently and forcefully advanced their views, whatever they may be in across the House, are indulging in some kind of illegitimate exercise. They're not. They're making important points on behalf of their constituents and in the national interest. They're doing their job. And I heard the Prime Minister say earlier that she didn't intend her comments last week to have that effect. And I'm now not sure what I'm more concerned about. One, that she made the comments, or secondly, that she didn't appreciate how they would actually be heard in the environment we're living in. But we cannot... I'll give away in just a minute. Nor can we find a way forward that's based simply on the proposition of putting and re-putting the same meaningful vote. The fact we're even discussing meaningful vote 3 or even 4 only has to be said to be seen to be absurd. The deal has been roundly rejected twice. We need now to move on, and I hope tonight that we can begin that process. I will give way.
To the right honourable and learned gentleman for giving way. I know he will have listened with great care to what the Cabinet Secretary has said about the government's alternative if Amendment A fails to win a majority. Does he share my concern that the government will only, in effect, allow indicative votes on the political declaration, and the assumption is that the withdrawal agreement will go through, cannot be touched or amended? And in that event, is this nothing more than a government ruse to get through the withdrawal amendment by some backdoor method? No.
Well, I'm grateful for that intervention. I did listen very carefully to what the Minister for the Cabinet Office said in relation to withdrawal agreement. I think in relation to the government's proposal, this is no disrespect to the Right Honourable gentleman, because I do respect him, but I think the trust in the government is not where it should be. And that isn't to disrespect anybody on the front bench sitting there, but it is to say this. When we voted to take no deal off the table and on extension, we were voting on the basis of the words that the Minister from the Cabinet Office said from that dispatch box about a short extension in the event that the meaningful vote failed being reckless. And therefore, when the letter was written to President Tusk last week, some of us were taken aback and did not think it reflected what we'd actually decided in this House. And that is one of the problems now in relation to this exercise, because there is a lack of trust that if this amendment is not passed this evening, that we may find that we're not where we thought we would be when we get to Wednesday or Thursday, Friday. It wouldn't be the first time. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to make some progress. I will give way in just a minute, and then I'll make some progress just for now. Mr. Speaker, the decision of the European Council to grant an extension of Article 50 was a necessity, and in truth the only way to prevent leaving without a deal on March the 29th. But I've said any extension must be for a purpose, which is why we need to come together and decide that purpose. The Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster said 2 weeks ago, and he's really elaborated on today, that the government would consult the usual channels with the other parties and work to provide the process by which the House could form a majority to take things forward. So it seems that the government agree with what the amendment tonight is intending to try to achieve. If it goes through, obviously Parliament or MPs will decide the options, which is right. But the government says that will give too much control to MPs. But then they go on to say, but if it doesn't go through, we'll provide the time. And as for the options, that should be for MPs. So, in fact, if they're true to what they're saying, the control goes to MPs to decide the options in any event. So the easiest thing would be simply to signal that they accept the amendment, and we could foreshorten the debate and move forward and then start the discussion about how that's actually going to work. Mr. Speaker, I'll complete this and then I'll give way. Our amendment, Amendment D in our name, seeks to achieve that purpose. Amendment A in the name of the Right Honourable Member for West Dorset and others does so. And we will be supporting both of those amendments this evening. I will give way.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. Does he agree it's important not just that MPs can determine the options that are voted on, but how those options are voted on? Many honourable members would be concerned if one was voted on after another rather than all at the same time. And the benefit of Amendment A is that it allows precisely that, for MPs to vote on all of those options at the same time, as well as determining what those options are.
I'm grateful for that intervention. It anticipates my next sentence, which says we recognise that members will have different views on how the process should go forward. And there will have to be intense discussion over the next couple of days as to how that operates. But it needs to be a process that allows us to arrive at a majority view and a sustainable majority view. I did say I'd give way.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable learned friend. And can I just put on record the utterly fantastic job he and his team have done on this issue to date. I just wondered if he could perhaps try and answer the question that the Prime Minister and the Duchy of the Lancaster has failed to answer when I've placed it twice already this afternoon, and that is, in the Prime Minister's statement, it says, unless this House agrees to it, no deal will not happen. What does he surmise that means? What do you think the government is trying to achieve?
Well, I think it's a version of what's gone before, which is to, on the one hand, say we accept that there's no majority for no deal in this House, and there certainly isn't, and I don't think there ever has been. But at the same time, leave the threat of no deal dangling by some kind of legal default. If that has meaning, and I hope it does, I think it ought to commit the government to take whatever steps are necessary in order to avoid no deal. Otherwise, it's meaningless, and it's really important that that is established. I'm going to make some. I will give way, and then I really am going to make some progress.
I'm very grateful to my honourable learned friend. It's on that very point. Isn't this another example of the double speak that we've come to expect from the government. And our concern here this evening is that we are witnessing another example of double-speak and indeed potentially double-dealing, because the implication of the acceptance, if you like, of both the spirit of the left-wing proposal and indeed its effect, while saying that at the same time the government won't be bound by it and they won't tell us exactly whether they're going to do precisely what it says, makes us all suspect that it is another piece of trickery designed to get this taken off the table tonight, only to find that we are no further forward tomorrow.
Well, I'm grateful for that intervention. I do think there's a trust issue. Hopefully that can improve, but there is a trust issue. And the letter to President Tusk was an example of that, because having supposedly taken no deal off the table, the only extension that was asked for was an extension in the event that the meaningful vote failed, rather than if it went through. And that left the prospect, but for what the EU Council decided last Thursday, of no deal this Friday going back on the table just a week after we thought we'd taken it off the table. I'm going to make some progress. So we do need to get into Wednesday. We need to have an intense discussion about how the votes on Wednesday are to be taken and see if we can reach consensus about that and actually reach a majority and find where that lies. We do need to consider the credible options. Labour have long advocated a close economic relationship, including a customs union and a single market alignment, but we've also made clear our support for a public vote as a lock on any deal that the Prime Minister passes. And the Leader of the Opposition and I have met with colleagues to discuss these proposals and the other ideas that have been put forward by other colleagues. What we need to do now is to agree the process for having a proper debate and to look at those and other credible options. I will give way.
Extremely generous. Does he agree with me that there is a difference between the people's vote, public vote option versus the others? The others relate to a substantive route forward on Brexit. A public vote is a way of ensuring that there is a broad consensus of the public behind whatever that consensus this House may find itself find favourable.
That's a very, very important intervention, and obviously there will be discussions over the next 2 days. But the basic proposition that the House needs to decide the substance of any deal that it might be able to support, and arguably to look at the process around it separately, is important, because some of these options are not like-for-like options, in the sense that some are about substance and some are about process. And it would be perfectly possible to say, to make the argument that if there's to be a deal, it ought to be what we consider to be the least damaging deal, and we could have an argument about what that looks like. But equally, it would be possible to say that whatever deal that was at the end of that exercise, it ought to be subject to the lock or safeguard of some sort of confirmation vote. Now, I don't know, I'm not anticipating how the votes would go, but I can see that there's one of those decisions is about the substance of the issue, the second is about the process. We're going to have to grapple with that before Wednesday. I will give way.
I'm most grateful to the right honourable and learned gentleman for giving way, because I agree entirely with what he's just said, as indeed I agree with my right honourable friend's question to him. And he may also agree that it's going to be really important in the course of this debate and how we structure it, that we make sure that we can provide reassurance that members can vote for what they see as preferred outcomes without in any way having the sense that they might be forfeiting the right to also the insistence that that has got to go to the public, whatever it might be.
I agree with that, because I think otherwise we inhibit the likelihood of actually finding a majority, and that therefore will require quite careful thought going into Wednesday. I will give way in just a minute again, but I'm going to make some remarks, because assuming for the moment we can find a process which most members are content with, and that we can then move towards a majority view, and it may take some time. And I for one, am troubled by the idea that in one afternoon all of this can be solved. It may be that all we can do is start down a process of finding a majority. And I think it would be wrong to rush at this stage of the exercise. But assuming that can be done, options are on what the result is before I can answer that question. I do understand the logic of that, and it's a fair point. But what I don't want is wrapped up in that perfectly reasonable, logical answer to find that in a week or two or whenever it may be, that whatever the outcome is that is agreed upon by a majority, it will never be accepted by the government, and we're back to where we started. And that's my concern about the exercise. So when the government says it will go into it in good faith, I think that has to mean that if there is a majority, the government will look very seriously at supporting where that majority view is and not simply rule it out. Because if we go back to the red lines, which is the very thing we're trying to break, or in other words, if the government applies its own red lines to any outcome and says it doesn't fit our red lines, then there's not much point going through the exercise in the first place, because it's precisely to remove those red lines that we're going forward. I will give way.
My right honourable and learned friend from giving way is making a very powerful point about the kind of absurdity of an ill-designed referendum that asked a very simplistic answer to a very complex question. And no one can really understand what that 52% wanted who voted leave, because it was so ill-defined and so massive, and the government has arrogantly assumed that it has a monopoly on wisdom of what that leave vote meant and actually holds Parliament in contempt in its pursuit of it. Is it not the reality that, as the Chancellor of the Exchequer has said, something like a confirmatory public vote would be actually entirely logically coherent? And it's bizarre that the Prime Minister, despite not having a mandate, despite not having a majority, seems so pig-headed, not actually reaching out to the House of Commons to actually pursue that sort of consensus-building approach.
I'm grateful for that intervention. I mean, on this question of the government accepting the outcome, I do think that if the government simply rejects whatever is the outcome of this exercise, it will be doubling down on one of the big mistakes of the last 2 years, which is to push Parliament away and not let Parliament express its view as to where the majority is, which is one of the reasons we're in this mess. I'll give way in just one moment. Because for 2.5 years the government has pushed Parliament away at every turn, and we need now to find a mechanism, albeit a constitutionally innovative mechanism, to actually break through that. Now, I will.
Does my right honourable friend, not recognise that in some areas there is huge opposition amongst the electorate to having European elections, but there is the opportunity through the withdrawal agreement bill, should it ever be reached, for every single option being potentially proposed on Wednesday to be put as amendments, including the customs union. Has my right honourable friend considered this as an option?
I have, not least because the honourable members raised it with me, I think, last week, and therefore I have considered it. I think the difficulty is this, that certainly the EU argue that once the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration are agreed, you can't, through domestic legislation, change the terms of those documents. And therefore, actually, whatever amendment you put down to the legislation, it couldn't alter the terms of the political declaration. So it's not accurate to say that all of this could somehow be swept up with the implementation bill, because the words in the document that you're seeking to implement have to be the words that the House is happy with and thus has agreed before we get to that stage. There are some things that could be dealt with in the implementation bill. I don't quarrel with that, but the EU will not countenance this House changing the terms of their agreement through amendments to the bill. It was one of the concerns the government rightly put in relation to the meaningful vote. When we were saying there should be amendments to the meaningful vote, the government's position was you can't really have amendments because this House can't amend the substance of the document. I will give way, and then I am going to make some progress because I realise how long I've been.
And would my right honourable friend not also accept, with the proposal put to him this afternoon of having separate votes on the political declaration and the withdrawal agreement, that it is the political declaration that is up for steering what happens in the next phase, whereas the EU has made clear that the withdrawal agreement itself is not for renegotiation with anyone at any time?
Well, I certainly accept the proposition that the EU has said the withdrawal agreement is not for reopening at any stage, and they've resisted that for month after month after month from the government. But I do remind myself and the House that in the letter that Presidents Tusk and Juncker wrote to the Prime Minister in, I think, January, they were very clear the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration are part of, I think in their words, the same negotiated package. And I also remind myself and the House that under Section 13 itself, the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration go together. Now, it doesn't mean there aren't different views on the agreement on the one hand and the declaration on the other, but they are part of the same negotiated package. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to make some progress because I want to indicate that we will also, we would have supported Amendment C, and we do support Amendment F in the name of the Right Honourable Member for Derby South. That obviously addresses a different point, which is how to prevent a no-deal outcome and ensuring this House can shape the extension process. They were matters that we thought we'd cleared up some weeks ago, but I think it is important that we come back to that amendment so that we can reassert the position going forward. But, Mr. Speaker, tonight really is about the opportunity to bring to an end the government's failed approach. For 2 years, they have not put up a credible plan or really listened to other alternatives. I used to say the Prime Minister was surviving by the week. I changed that to saying she was surviving by the day. Now she appears to be surviving by the hour to get through to Wednesday. But really, enough's enough. We can't go on like this. The country deserves better, and Parliament must take back control. And we've got the chance to do that tonight, and we should do it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Sir Oliver Letwin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Amendment A has already been much discussed in the course of this debate, and I don't want to detain the House for very long. I do want, first of all, though, to say what it is trying to do and what it is not trying to do. In the first place, it is not some kind of massive constitutional revolution, though I know that some of my honourable friends and others have suggested it is. The truth is that, as you yourself said, Mr. Speaker, earlier in the debate, the House, since its inception, has owned its standing orders. And in fact, under the principle of comity, one of the most fundamental principles of our Constitution, the courts have never sought to intervene in the proceedings of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and have recognised that the House, in each case, controls its own proceedings. And as a matter of fact, the idea that it's an ancient constitutional principle that the government should control the order paper is slightly unhistorical, if that's the right word, because it started in 1906, which, as far as I'm aware, is not part of our ancient constitution. For about 400 or 500 years, things which either were or were very much like the House of Commons controlled their own order papers, and that changed at the beginning of the 20th century. But what didn't change was the fundamental point that the way that standing orders are decided is by a majority vote in the House of Commons, and therefore they can be adjusted by a majority vote in the House of Commons, and if so adjusted, then what applies is the adjusted version. And that's actually what happens every time that there's a private member's bill Friday, when, astonishingly, the government does something which apparently we're now entreated to regard as utterly revolutionary, which is that it hands over to private members the opportunity to put forward bills, which, according to this soi-disant constitutional theory which has now been invented, must be a kind of revolution, because it's not the government putting forward a bill. But in fact, we've been doing it for years perfectly happily. So there's no revolutionary intent here at all. The second point I want to make is what the amendment does do, and it does exactly what has been described in the foregoing debate, namely, it provides simply, nothing more, an opportunity for the House of Commons to begin, and I want to stress the word begin, the process of working its way towards identifying a way forward that can command a majority in this House. And I just want to reflect for a second on my own personal history in this matter. I find sometimes from the communications, not always utterly polite, that I received from various quarters on my iPhone, that it's supposed that I have from the beginning attempted to destroy the government's efforts to carry out an orderly Brexit. Now, this is obviously a more amusing story than the real one, but the real one is very sad. It's very ordinary. I started as an entirely loyal member of the Conservative Party. I'd never voted against the Conservative whip in my entire parliamentary career, not once. And what's more, although I voted Remain in the referendum, I was absolutely determined that we should continue our proceedings by ensuring that we fulfilled the mandate of the British people and left the European Union. And for a very long while, although I personally thought from the very beginning that the Prime Minister was unwise to set out her red lines, I swallowed my concerns about that and utterly supported her in her endeavour to get her version of leave across the line. And indeed, on frequent occasions, as several of my right honourable friends will recall, acted as a kind of broker to try to put together my ERG colleagues with other colleagues now sitting in various parts of the House to produce results, some of which are now encoded, as a matter of fact, in Section 13. It was my endeavour to make this a process which did actually enable the Prime Minister to get to the end of the road successfully. And just finally on that, I have actually fulfilled that by trying to vote for her on every occasion on which she's brought a Section 13 motion. And I apologise to members opposite for saying that I will again do that if the Prime Minister brings a meaningful vote, 3 or 4 or infinity. I will go on voting for the Prime Minister's deal because I happen to think it's perfectly okay. I'm very conscious, many members in the House don't agree with me. The problem we've been facing, and this is something on which we can all agree, all of us, all 650 of us can agree, is that we haven't been able to get a majority for her deal. This is the fact. And that is a problem. And it's a problem because if you don't have a majority for that deal and you want to leave the EU, then you are forced down only one of 2 possible tracks. One is to find an alternative, and the other is to have no deal. And it was at the point, I will in a moment, it was at the point when I discovered, or surmised, a few months back, that there was a real possibility that the Prime Minister, I think by mistake rather than on purpose, was going to end up by taking us out without a deal, without having adequately prepared for that, that I became so concerned that I started to work on a cross-party basis with many colleagues in on both sides of the House to try to find a solution. And this modest attempt to provide the House with an opportunity to vote in the majority in favour of an alternative way forward is simply part of that process. I give way.
I'm very grateful for him to give way. And I think there is a sentiment in this House that we need to compromise somehow. And I've asked the Prime Minister earlier. For me, it was unthinkable to ever vote for a Brexit deal. Why is it so unthinkable for the members opposite to agree to support a people's vote for whatever Brexit deal we come together for?
I think what I'd say to the Honourable Lady is that if we go through the process which I hope we can inaugurate this evening, one of the things we will all have to do is to seek compromise. If we all vote for that which is our first preference, I think we almost know that we will never get to a majority solution. I don't believe there is a majority in favour of the first preferences of any person in this House. Yes.
I do thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. We've heard today from the Prime Minister, and we also heard from my honourable friend, the member for Holborn and St Pancras, that there is not going to be an immediate guarantee that whatever majority we find in this House will become the established policy of either of the 2 main political parties. And does he share my concern that we may actually end up in a situation where we manifest a majority for a deal that is not quite right for the Conservative Party, is not quite right for the Labour Party, then the whip system kicks in, and then suddenly there is no majority in Parliament at all. And in my mind, that makes no deal very dangerous and very real.
The danger that the honourable gentleman speaks of is real. We all face it. There is a solution to it, which is to ensure that as we approach a majority, we sufficiently discuss that, not only amongst all of us on the backbenches, but also with the 2 front benches, to ensure that there is what I think the Shadow Brexit Secretary rightly referred to a few moments ago as a sustainable majority. What we need is not just a majority for something, but a majority for something that will continue to persist as the various stages have to be carried through. And that must be our aim. Of course, I can wait.
Whose every word I've agreed so far, if we say so with respect. But he just reached a few moments ago the key moment, which is, as his amendment doesn't set out precisely the form that the indicative votes will take, there's a real danger that if everybody votes for their first preference, we won't produce a majority for anything. Now, his amendment does not set out the basis upon which the indicative vote motions are to be tabled. How are we to resolve the method by which we table them? Because it's the opinion of the Honourable Member for Bishop Auckland and myself that the single transferable vote is the best way of steering people to one conclusion. It will force compromise, apart from those who will only vote for their first preference. Unless he has another better alternative, how does he guard against the danger of nothing getting a majority?
Well, my right honourable friend is asking what is clearly one of the right questions, and I give him two answers. The first is, I think we need to think very seriously, both in the next 24 hours, if this amendment does pass, about the shape of the business of the House motion for Wednesday, which will determine the process for Wednesday, to answer his question on that front, and indeed about how the process will carry forward beyond that. My own view is that, at least to begin with, it may be wiser simply to disclose where the votes lie on a plain vanilla basis, certainly, and the honourable lady opposite made this point very forcefully a few moments ago, certainly on the basis of all the voting going on at once, with pink slips in the lobbies at the end of the debate, and not sequentially, so we don't have gaming of sequence, but on the basis where we discover which propositions that have been put forward command significant support and which do not, in the hope that actually, as politicians, and we should remind ourselves we are not just an ordinary electorate, we are politicians, we have spent our lives in this business, that we can, in the succeeding few days, zero in on something that could be a compromise, that could get a majority, having observed the lie of the land. I don't at all, and this is my second part of my answer, I don't at all discount the possibility that at a later stage, and I'm sure that there will have to be a later stage, and indeed I hope that the business of the House motion will book a slot for a later stage, that we should resort to some other method to crystallise the majority if we find that it's otherwise difficult to do. Of course, that's a
very brief intervention. Given the process could take a few days more, as my honourable friend clearly explains, doesn't that underline we better crack on Wednesday? And if the government won't commit to Wednesday for some peculiar unknown reason, if it doesn't and it's wind up tonight, it's absolutely essential that we pass his amendment.
I find myself in a very odd position of being slightly harder line even than my right honourable friend on this. I'm afraid I think we have to press this amendment tonight because I don't believe the government has yet got a clear view, actually, of how it would conduct this process. And I think the terms of the amendment, which have been very carefully considered over quite a long time, are structured in a way that maximises our flexibility and our capacity as a House to work together. Of course, we should work with both front benches on formulating Wednesday in the best possible way and producing a business of the House motion which, if possible, is a matter of consensus, but that's best done under the framework of this amendment, and we should press it tonight. Yes, of course.
The right honourable gentleman for giving way, and I'll be supporting his amendment tonight, and I'm happy to have put my name on it to support. And what he said about not rushing through this all in one day, I think is a very important point. I think we do need time. I think there's reasonable concerns that people don't want to suddenly be deciding on the future relationship potentially of the country for 40 years in a couple of hours in here. So I was pleased to hear what he said about this process being a start of a process, but also would he agree with me that the importance of us all getting together and setting that business House motion is that we ensure it is a fair, balanced process that enjoys the confidence of all sides of the House, all parties, all persuasions in this, and that it's not seen as loaded to one direction or the other, or indeed the government's policy.
I very thoroughly agree with the honourable gentleman about that. I think it is possible, and should be possible for us at this juncture above all, to ensure that the neutrality of the process is guaranteed. Of course, we will have conflicting views about the ideal outcome, But if we're to come together on an outcome that all of us can tolerate and consequently achieves a sustainable majority, we are going to have to ensure that the process by which we have got to that is one that everybody recognises is fair and neutral as between the various options. Of course I shall, but will the two honourable members allow me? I did promise that I would give way to the right honourable lady, or not.
So I think it's just to confirm everything that the honourable gentleman has said about how he started off and continues to believe in the delivery of Brexit, and his description of his journey is accurate, Mr Speaker, but he's answered my question because it was, will he push it to the vote, and if he will, why? But I think he's made that very clear to the House.
I'm delighted to give way, of course.
Member for West Dorset for giving way, and as he knows, I strongly support his amendment, and he is making an extremely important speech. Would he agree as well, though, that the government has effectively taken 2 years to get to this point? It is not unreasonable for the House, in this unusual and difficult situation we are in, to recognise that it is likely to take us more than 1 day to attempt to do what, frankly, the government should have done quite a long time ago. And can I therefore urge him, when he's thinking about this further steps, to highlight the importance of us identifying a further day next week in order to be able to have similar debates and discussions, if we so need it, to come to a conclusion, but also urging the government to also think about what it should be doing to provide for these further votes in order to come to a consensus, and to recognise there may also need to be further binding votes in this process as well.
Unsurprisingly, given the close cooperation there has been between us, I entirely agree with everything that the Right Honourable Lady's just said. It is of the utmost importance that the business of the House motion, when it comes on Wednesday, should also provide for a further day or days in which to take a process which begins on Wednesday and reach a successful conclusion. And of course it is also the case that we will have to attend to the question which has been discussed this evening and began to be aired when the Prime Minister was making her statement and answering questions on it, which is the question, what will the government do if the House reaches a majority view, not for some unicorn, not for some ludicrous proposition which utterly contradicts common sense, but for a sensible way forward? How do we persuade at that stage the government to allow that majority view to be implemented? That will be a major issue. Of course.
I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for giving way, and as he knows, I support his amendment and I'm going to vote for it tonight. And I'm delighted that he's agreed that we need to move to paper ballots and end some of the gamesmanship which has been going on. The Father of the House raised the issue of the voting system, so I won't repeat that. But in addition, there are two other points which we need to bear in mind. One is whether the votes are indicative or definitive, and maybe we might move from one to the other, as the Right Honourable Member for Pontefract and Castleton said. But the other one is how an option gets onto the ballot paper, and that's also an extremely tricky, nice issue. And what I want to know from the Right Honourable Gentleman is whether he doesn't think we don't need time, perhaps, to amend the business of the House motion, because the way we do it is also a subject for discussion, as well as going on to do it.
I was with the Honourable Lady just to the end, but not quite to the end. I'm conscious that although the point that her Right Honourable friend made a minute or two ago is right, that we should allow ourselves a couple of days to do what should have been done over a couple of years, we are also under very considerable time pressure. There is a reality of the situation, which is that on the 11th we hit the buffers. And therefore, I think we shouldn't spend too much time debating the process. We should, if possible, move forward on the basis of sufficient consensus about the process not to have to debate it and get on with the substance. And to that end, I think it would be sensible if we begin this process by allowing those members who wish to put forward alternatives to do so, and there are groups of people who support whatever it may be, the people's vote as a confirmatory process or otherwise, Norway or Norway Plus, or the particular propositions hitherto put forward by the opposition, or whatever it might be. I think we need to let those members in the ordinary way formulate their propositions in their own terms. Mr. Speaker has a long record, and previous speakers have had a long record, while we're at it, of finding a way of selecting those amendments that carry sufficient weight in terms of numbers and cross-party support and so on to be considered by the House by selecting them for debate. And I think that's a perfectly proper process to use. It doesn't involve anyone of us tilting the playing field, and it enables us to proceed without too much further debate about the process. I will, but then once I've done so, I'm going to conclude.
He's been very generous. Can I say we'll be delighted to support his amendment? And the reason is, if the House controls this, it's likely that all of the options can be considered, yes, including revocation, which is the only thing we can do unilaterally. And I say that to him publicly now, partly as a pitch for it to be on the options paper, but mainly to say I rather lack the trust in the government that they would actually include all of the valid options if they were in control of the timetable.
Yeah, that's fine.
Actually, I'm very glad I did give way to the honourable gentleman, because, first of all, I'm obviously very grateful that he and his colleagues will be supporting the amendment. Secondly, I wholeheartedly endorse what he says. Personally, I am utterly opposed to revocation. I'm also, actually, at the moment, wholly unpersuaded of the merits of a people's vote. But both of those are obviously serious things to consider. Incidentally, I'm also radically opposed to no-deal exit. But if some of my colleagues wish to put forward that as a serious proposition, I think it is a serious proposition. It would need to be debated. So, yes, it is essential that we should be able to look at all of the serious options, not wild unicorns, but things we could actually do and could actually carry forward this process in one direction or another. And I feel very confident, Mr. Speaker, that when you look at sensibly phrased amendments as motions of very different kinds, you will choose for debate all those which are serious possibilities that the House needs to consider. That is in the interest of the House and in the interest of the nation. I want just to end by mentioning one thing which comes from a personal experience, and colleagues on the Liberal Democrat benches may recall this, as well as some of my own honourable friends on these benches. There was a time in 2010 when this nation faced another cliff edge. We were within days of the Bank of England discovering that our creditors would not finance the UK anymore. It was just after the 2010 election. Nobody had won the election. It was clear that nobody could form a government except by coalition. We were very heavily indebted due to what had happened in 2008. And what we were told by the Governor of the Bank of England was that if a coalition was not formed pretty quickly, he personally felt that the lenders would go on strike and we would have a meltdown. And, of course, there were then discussions between the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party, and between the Liberal Democrats and the Conservative Party. And I was a part of the Conservative Party team on that occasion. And I was informed, when we had finished those negotiations and had brought them to a successful conclusion, that the cleverest and most experienced people in the civil service, and incidentally, I don't wish to demean the civil servant, I hardly can because my wife was a senior civil servant, had put their collective minds to the task and formed teams in order to find out whether it was possible to have a coalition agreement either between the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats or between the Liberal Democrats and the Conservative Party. And they had worked this through in awesome detail. And they had convinced themselves that it was absolutely impossible to form a coalition. It could not be done. We sat down, and 4 days later, there was a coalition agreement. And why did that come about? It came about because it was politicians who sat down and weren't concerned with the kinds of things that people are concerned with when they are very brilliant administrators, but were concerned with trying to find out how to accommodate the essential requirements of the other side. This is, of course, the process that should have been gone through 2 years back in this connection. But we have the opportunity to do it now, and I hope and pray that the House, if it does vote for this amendment, will not see this simply as a set of votes in the abstract, but as the beginning of a process in which, by discovery of where the
Stephen Gethins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this morning I left my home not far from the town of St Andrews in my constituency to set off on my regular commute, like other members of this House from different parts of the United Kingdom, quite literally by plane, train and automobile. Like most weeks, like many of us, I had no idea when I'd be going home to my family and to my constituents. But unlike most weeks, I, my family and my constituents had no idea that by the time I got home, whether or not I would still be afforded the rights and privileges that EU citizens take as their own. What a state to be in all these years on. And this is why today, can I thank the Right Honourable Member for West Dorset and the Right Honourable Member for Derby South as well, and to their colleagues for the work that they've put in to their amendments that obviously we'll be backing this evening. And I thank them for that. But what a state to be in all these years on. Because we're not here for any other reason than an attempt to offset a Tory civil war. This disaster is years in the making. And we're only in this situation because once upon a time David Cameron decided to call an EU referendum so that he could have avoided a full-blown Tory civil war. Now, there are many who will disagree with me in this House. But I'm not sure there are many who will disagree with me in saying that it's not working very well, is it? How's that attempt to avoid a Tory civil war going? Minister want to intervene after that? No, I didn't think so. I didn't think so, because we have a full-blown civil war. And this is a Tory party determined to take the rest of us down with them as well. And what today's amendment gives us the opportunity to do is for the moment stave off that opportunity that they are trying to give to us. Because the Prime Minister continues to appeal to the hardliners in her own party rather than face up to the realities of minority government. But this is a lost cause. The Brexiteers who campaigned without any sort of plan are the ones who got us out of this mess. And frankly, the message to the Prime Minister must be, Mr. Speaker, that they are unlikely to get us out of it. Now, it's not for me to judge Conservative Party management. The voters will have their opportunity to do that in due course. But what strikes me is just how enthralled this Conservative Party and this Prime Minister is to the extremists in her own party. And with that, I want to praise some of the members on the other side, because there are members who have stuck their neck out. There are members, and I disagree with them, and they disagree with me, but let's look at the way they've been treated. Now, the members for Grantham and Stamford, who's in his place, the member for Leicestershire South, and I disagree over plenty. And we disagree over Brexit. He wants us to leave the European Union. I don't. But he finds himself in a situation whereby when we see these positive proposals, we don't always agree, or when we see one that's even accepted by the government, as was the case for the member for Leicestershire South, the member present finds himself deselected, and the member for Leicestershire South finds himself sacked. And yet all along, and I disagree with them for this, they have backed the Prime Minister's deal. What's that tell you? What does that tell you about trying to find some kind of consensus? What's that tell you about trying to reach across? This is a government that is enthralled to the very extremes, and it is something that we cannot put up with any longer in this House. Let's just look at the invitation list to those who were treated to lunch at Chequers, the very people voting against the Prime Minister. This tells us everything about a Prime Minister who's lost control of her own party, and who has dragged us into this folly. And I'll give way to the Honourable Lady because she's got some experience in this.
Indeed, and I'm very grateful for giving way. Did it strike him as being quite perverse that the very people invited to Chequers were the very people who in December had sought a motion of no confidence in the Prime Minister as leader of the Conservative Party and had plotted against her? But is he also aware that a lot of Conservative associations hold their annual general meetings at the end of this week? And does he share my concern that too many honourable and right honourable members opposite will be more concerned about the outcome of those AGMs than the effect of a no deal or indeed any Brexit on their constituents?
The Honourable Lady knows the Conservative Party much better than I do, and it shows, and she makes a very, very valid point. And the point is this, Mr Speaker, it is a small elitist group of Conservative MPs, all men incidentally who are invited to Chequers, incidentally, who have failed and failed spectacularly on their pet, lifelong political project. Mr Speaker, I wouldn't let this lot anywhere near the TV remote in my house, never mind the most important decision that we have to make for generations. And I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
I'm very grateful for giving way. Can we extend that? Can we extend that actually to listen to apparently a mob of people that will rebel if ever we are not going to deliver this vote of the people, and nobody listens to the peaceful million, the 5 million people who want to actually revote our Article 50. They're not death-threatening us. They're not mobbing us. They are just peaceful people, and yet we are worried about those keyboard warriors who will threaten us from the security of their homes. Is that not also wrong?
The Honourable Lady makes a very powerful point about the way that millions protested peacefully on Saturday. And I'm delighted that our First Minister joined them, as did the leader of the Liberal Democrats, colleagues in the Labour Party, and even some Conservative colleagues as well. And they were right to have done so. Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister is effectively out of power, and we need to move on. Debating her particular position, which, as you have rightly pointed out, has been rejected twice overwhelmingly, means that it becomes more and more pointless to debate the Prime Minister's deal with every passing hour. And the opposition spokesperson was right to point that out too. The House of Commons must seize control of this process tonight so that we can hold those indicative votes and start to find out a way out of this mess. Now, we know from the UK Government's own warnings that the Prime Minister's deal is not in the best interest of anybody in the UK. And we know that no deal is not in anybody's best interest either. And this Parliament has come together and has rejected both the Prime Minister's deal and no deal. Comprehensively, they have been rejected. Would he give way on that? But having wasted almost 3 years, the government has run out of options and run out of ideas, and we need to step up. Now, believe it or not, Mr Speaker, none of this should give us any pleasure. Where we are today is not a farce. It is now a tragedy, and a tragedy that is taking us all down with us. And I say somebody who, as you know, fundamentally wants Scotland to be an independent state, but it really gives me no pleasure when I speak to colleagues overseas and see that the UK's international reputation is broken. And that hurts all of us. And it doesn't give me any great pleasure, and I assure colleagues it gives me no great pleasure to have to say that. When I was working in the European institutions, I could remember that overall in the EU, and I'm appealing to the Minister, and I know the Minister works hard on this as well, that the UK could be a real force for good. Now, I didn't always agree with everything the UK was there for, but I acknowledge many of the positive contributions made by UK citizens to the EU project. And I think it's right that all of us acknowledge that. What was more striking, however, was the way in which the UK and Ireland worked as the closest possible allies and partners in the European Union. For the first time in that troubled history, there was truly a working as a partnership of equals alongside other European states. Now, and again it gives me, and I suspect it gives the Irish, no pleasure in this either, the boot which has historically been on the foot of the UK is now on the other foot. As Robert Cooper wrote in the FT, the smallest insiders, Dublin in the case of Brexit, matter more than the biggest outsiders, the UK. That tells us everything about solidarity and the working of the European Union. But even here, the Irish don't crow, but they've been honest brokers. The best friends any of us can possibly have, are our most critical friends, the one that tell us the truth when we want to see it the least. And I've heard, when these matters of truth have come out, Brexiteers getting enraged and annoyed at the truths that they dare speak from Dublin. Can I remind all members here that Ireland is independent and it is not coming back, and it's not difficult to see why. Independent states thrive in the European Union. It is a means of strengthening democracy and sovereignty. The EU is a partnership of equals in a way that the UK simply is not. Now, I want to see Scotland as a full and independent member state of the European Union. That would be healthier in our relationship as a modern, outward-looking nation, as the same way as it's been healthy for the Anglo-Irish relationship as well. Now, here in the UK, people are seeing through this mess. And, Mr. Speaker, as we referenced earlier on, at the weekend, hundreds of thousands, the length and breadth of the UK, marched for our collective futures. Since then, and at the last look, the revocation of Article 50 petition, and this is at the last look, has been signed by 5.5 million people, including 17% of the electorate in my own constituency. And that's not even the highest one in Scotland. Millions of people can see what this government cannot. And what this government clearly cannot see, but what these people can see, is that when you're careering towards the cliffs, you slam on the brakes. That's what they're there for.
Right. On that point, will you give way?
And let's not forget that Parliament has that power, as was recognised by the Court, has that power because the UK Parliament throughout this has retained and always will retain in these circumstances sovereignty in a way that the Scottish Parliament does not. Spot the difference, everybody. The UK Parliament, as a member of the EU, retains sovereignty. The Scottish Parliament, as this process has shown us, does not. It may provide a mechanism for doing those. All we represent untold damage in this article. And on that point, I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
Yeah, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. He's making a very powerful speech. I just want to ask him about something the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster said from the Treasury bench earlier, when he said that revoking Article 50 could only ever be done once and it would be permanent and could never be reversed. Has he, like me, read the decision of the Grand Chamber of the Court of Justice? Does he, like me, agree that the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster has got that wrong? And if this House chose to revoke Article 50, it would be possible at some point in the future to re-notify Article 50 notice, provided that was done in good faith.
Well, as usual, my honourable and learned friend makes a very, very powerful point. I know she tried to intervene on the Chancellor of the Duchy, but I know that the Treasury bench will be listening to that and will be taking note of that as well. Do you know what really struck me today as well? We were told the biggest problem is the European elections. Let me tell them something. The biggest problem with this is not the European elections. The biggest problem is not people taking part in a democratic election. The biggest problem are the jobs the government's plans are going to be costing, the public services that will be hit by this Brexit, and the opportunities for future generations that all of us have had and that we will deny to them. This biggest problem aren't these parliamentarians being elected. And let me tell the members something else. What the European Parliament does is each and every member of the European Parliament is elected. It sits at the heart of the European project. We sit in a parliament where not even half of the parliamentarians who serve here are elected. It's a disgrace. It really is a disgrace. This will cause us a huge amount of damage just because they want to avoid the democracy and scrutiny that comes with a European Parliament election. But, Mr. Speaker, I'm not that surprised when we have a Prime Minister who, as we heard today, opposes a referendum, opposes giving people a say in this momentous decision, and is even opposed to respecting the will of Parliament, as we're being told. Now, if the Brexit debate has done anything, it has shown that the UK and the way in which it operates is no longer fit for purpose, as the House of Lords amply illustrates. The EU is not perfect. No union involving 28 sovereign and independent member states ever can be. However, critically, it has the checks and balances to protect the smallest members from the largest. Now, within the UK, we have a constitutional setup that is somewhat outdated, that's not caught up with the momentous decisions that we're having to make now. But in the EU, you have a modern and up-to-date relationship between member states, a partnership of equals, a true partnership of equals. And I say this to a government that has failed to respect devolution throughout this process. The EU would not be allowed to do that. It cannot be allowed to do that. And to the people of Scotland, our message is this. There is a better way of doing this. And a better way that our friends and neighbours, our nearest neighbours in places like Ireland and Denmark are pursuing successfully. This is not as good as it gets. But in the meantime, and until that point, it's up to each and every one of us to continue to work as constructively as we can. Now, I don't want to see our friends and neighbours from south of the border being dragged over a cliff edge by an out-of-touch and irresponsible group of Tories, anti-EU ultras. No country deserves that. Now, the easiest thing for any of us in Scotland would be to say, we voted against this. It's not our problem. But actually it is our problem. And it remains our problem at the moment. And we can't just say, well, the Tories made this mess, it's for them to clear up, because it is clear they are incapable of clearing up the mess that they have made. The damage that these plans would do to everyone across these islands would be devastating for us all and felt for decades to come. I'll thank the members again and those who have worked constructively. Today's motion provides a start, but it is only that, a start on undoing this devastating Brexit that has been brought to us by a Tory party that's out of control.
Thank you. Sir Nicholas Soames.
Mr. Speaker, I will not long delay the House, and can I congratulate the honourable gentleman on some very interesting points that he made, many of which I find myself in agreement with, and may I congratulate my right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset, for his absolutely formidable speech, which renders anything that I can say in support of it pretty nugatory. I will, Mr. Speaker, be voting for Amendment A tonight, but I want to, if I may, make some general points in this debate. I believe, Mr. Speaker, that it is of the greatest importance for our country that we should now move to a conclusion on what is merely the beginning of a tortuous road that will eventually lead to our departure from the European Union. I voted, like my right honourable friend, to trigger Article 50 despite serious reservations on the timing, and I have voted with the government in every single division on the Withdrawal Act and every other piece of legislation to advance the delivery of Brexit. I have voted to leave and honour the referendum many more times than my honourable friends, the member for Uxbridge, South Ruislip, North East Somerset, Rayleigh and Wickford, Wickham and many others. And I find it ironic that those who apparently wish most fervently to leave are those who have most consistently voted against the withdrawal agreement and thus inhibited any real progress. I should make it clear, Mr. Speaker, that there are no circumstances that I will vote for a no deal, nor will I back what would be a deeply divisive second referendum. Both are a recipe for further chaos and division, which should be unacceptable to all sides of this argument, for whom surely it is time for logic and common sense to prevail. Like my right honourable friend, the member for Penrith and the Border, I still believe in sanity. This is a country with a profound tradition of moderation and common sense. Our democratic institutions are elastic enough to be capable of compromise and of moving from the rhetoric of rejection and to the painful necessity of an actual deal. And it grieves me very much to see our influence abroad, as the honourable gentleman for North East Fife said, to see our influence abroad being so degraded as allies and partners who are close friends watch from afar with dismay as we burn up our reservoirs of goodwill and our reputation for common sense, most especially in the European Union. Indeed, although it doesn't feel like it at the moment, this ancient country in which we are so very privileged to live is in general marked apart from many others by the tolerance, good nature and generally civilised manner of its democracy and institutions. These are qualities that are envied the world over. They need careful nurturing and are currently entirely absent from the field. What on earth has happened to our pragmatism, our self-restraint and our common sense? And it grieves me that our reputation is now under such extreme pressure both at home and abroad. Indeed, our reputation has been gravely diminished. And I greatly regret having to speak in this way in our Parliament. Indeed, I cannot believe that I should need to do so. But like many others, I find myself truly distraught at the painful, difficult and intractable position in which our country finds itself. And what I really want to see, as I'm sure do most members of this House, is that the government should be able to get on with the work of creating a more confident and hope-filled country that really cares for the weakest amongst us and for those who find their lives to be complicated and difficult, and that encourages opportunity, enterprise and life chances, and most especially keeps its vision of global service and influence as a long-standing force for humanity and the general good. All of us, Mr. Speaker, I won't if I may, because many others want to speak, please forgive me. All of us know that many of our constituents are understandably extremely angry that Brexit has so distracted the government from the very serious issues that we face. The NHS, education, crime, the reform of social care, housing, the environment, climate change, and all the other great issues that have inevitably had to be neglected as Brexit has gradually sucked the lifeblood out of the government. The public believe, Mr. Speaker, as you very well know, that we have collectively let them down badly. And this is leading inevitably, and in my view very seriously, to the fraying of the bonds between Parliament and the nation. So, Mr. Speaker, in my judgment, the national interest clearly dictates that we have got to get this done, and that we must now get on with the vital work of establishing our future relationships with our most important economic partners and allies. Mr. Speaker, at the beginning of the business of the House every day, the Speaker's chaplain reads the prayer that enjoins us most especially to never lead the nation wrongly through love of power, desire to please, or unworthy ideals, but laying aside all private interests and prejudices to keep in mind their responsibility to seek to improve the condition of all mankind. Mr. Speaker, all of us need to pay a little more attention to those wise and profound and humane words which have guided and succoured this House through thick and thin down the years and in worse days than now. It's now time that Parliament did its duty by the country for the national interest and for national unity, and regardless of party or inclination, to bring these matters to a belated conclusion.
Dame Margaret Beckett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is, as ever, a great pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Member for Mid Sussex, except that I think I should perhaps place on record on the one issue on which I totally disagree with what he said, and also his member for his Right Honourable friend for West Dorset, which is that I feel that the only way that we will resolve this situation peacefully and in a way that can bring people together is indeed to go back to the people for confirmation of whatever decision this House decides to make. Otherwise, I fear we will be seen literally as people who are engaged in an establishment stitch-up to think of something that we then foist on them. I believe it's essential to seek their view. But I'm very conscious, sir, that today's is a crowded agenda. And I believe that the amendment standing in my name and that of others across the House is so straightforward that it practically speaks for itself. So it is my intention to be very brief. I'm also mindful of how many others want to speak. I recognise, of course, that the House has voted on more than one previous occasion against the UK leaving the EU without a deal, and the Prime Minister indeed has acknowledged that. I'm also well aware that there are nevertheless members who feel that, whatever the evidence to the contrary, leaving with no deal would not cause us major problems, and that there are even some who actively support our leaving without a deal or at least regard it as a desirable outcome. But surely there are few, if any, who believe it would be desirable that the UK should not make such a decision, but drift into it, or fall into it by inadvertence, perhaps almost by accident. That would be the very definition of irresponsibility. And we still have a very tight timetable, which in addition, at present, now encompasses a potential recess period. So my amendment, as I say, is extremely simple, extremely straightforward. It seeks to ensure that the UK can only leave the EU without a deal with the explicit consent of the House of Commons. Yes.
Our right honourable friend is making a very important speech about the risks of no deal. Would she agree with me that given that the Prime Minister herself said today, unless the House agrees to it, no deal will not happen? However, she has not provided for any process to ensure that there are those safeguards in place, and that, therefore, we need the amendment that she has put forward. Otherwise, there is a danger that we could just drift by accident into the kind of chaotic, damaging no deal that both the CBI and the TUC have warned against.
My honourable friend makes a very powerful point in line with the many contributions she has made on this issue, and I'm coming to that in a moment. So the amendment guards against a no-deal withdrawal that lacks the clear and evident consent of the House. It also allows for the possibility of the House being in recess when such a danger arose, and provides for the seeking of any necessary extension of the leaving deadline. And I was, as my right honourable friend for Pontefract said a moment ago, originally very much encouraged by the Prime Minister's statement made today that, as she says, and I quote, "Unless this House agrees to it, no deal will not happen," close quotes. That is what this amendment says. So my hope had been that the government might be prepared simply to accept it. It would seem to be the logical thing to do. I am giving the vehicle by which they can give effect to the statement that the Prime Minister made today. And I listened with care to the Chancellor of the Duchy. And I think what he said was that despite the government the fact the government is not taking any steps, as my right honourable friend for Pontefract just pointed out, to prevent us simply running out of time, that was not necessary. He said the problem with my proposal was that there would then be only two options left before the House, and that the legal default would be that we leave without a deal. That's the point, Mr. Speaker. That's why I tabled the amendment, because I know, although I appreciated the Chancellor's explanation, I know that otherwise we would leave by legal default without a deal. And he said, indeed, that the government accepts, he agreed, the government will need to come back to the dispatch box to deal with these issues. So I do suggest to the Minister on the front bench to pass on to his right honourable friend that really the very simple thing to do, which need take really no time at all, is simply to accept this amendment and to ensure that the House does not run that indefensible risk of stumbling out of the EU without a deal.
Thank you. Mr Dominic Grieve.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and it's a pleasure to participate in this debate and to follow the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Derby South, and I can tell her now that I shall be voting for her amendment if it is put to the vote, as I hope it will be at the end of the evening. I shall return to that in a moment. Mr Speaker, I'm the second signatory on Amendment A, and I just wanted briefly to outline my thoughts as to its necessity and why I think it may help the House. I've obviously approached this in a slightly different way from that of my right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset. As the House will be perfectly well aware, I continue to believe that Brexit is a historic mistake of very great proportions, and I'm afraid at no time since the referendum took place have I ever felt, despite efforts on my part to do so, that we are moving towards a position where I could ever take the view that the future outside of the EU was going to be better than remaining in it. But I certainly voted to trigger Article 50 because I did it in deference to the result of the referendum and in the full knowledge that we couldn't even start negotiations unless we did so. And although I've occasionally been characterised as trying to obstruct Brexit, the truth is that throughout the period of 2017 and 18, most of the work I did was to try to improve the process because of the concerns that I had that the process was being shortcut, thereby making the likelihood of mistaken outcomes all the more likely. I think there was only 2 occasions when I actually voted on substantive motions about alternatives, but that was because I was rather worried about the extent to which the government seemed to be self-imposing red lines, and on neither occasion did it come anywhere close to success, and I accepted that. And accepted also that I should reserve my position on what the government was negotiating, and indicated that on a number of occasions in debates. Where I disagree or differ from my right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset, is that when I finally came to look at the government's deal as negotiated in December, I have to say that I thought it was a deal that is going to condemn us to a third-rate future. And I'm afraid that's the basis on which I have been unwilling to support it. In saying that, I'm entirely mindful of the fact that it's been negotiated in good faith by my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, and I believe that every member of the front bench has exercised as much diligence as possible to get the best possible outcome. And of course, that then does raise another question. If the outcome secured in December is so unsatisfactory that it is defeated by 220 votes in this House, and defeated in a way because the examination of it from differing directions by honourable members on all sides of the House find it wanting, that does, to my mind, call into question whether in fact a fundamental error has been made and that the entire process has inherent flaws in it. And the difficulty that then arises is that one of the tendencies that has crept in throughout the whole of this debate, ever since the referendum result came out, has been a tendency to close down debate on the basis that it is not proper to pursue it because the referendum result must act as a diktat which prevents such debate taking place. Now, Mr. Speaker, I've been long enough in this House to have experienced this sort of argument before, sometimes when governments may get very large majorities in general elections. I even remember on one occasion a member of this House arguing that because the then Labour government had such a big majority, there was no real need anymore to have the second reading debate of bills, because the matter should be just put through on the nod. Seriously, and that therefore we should just move on to the detail. And the one thing I am absolutely persuaded about is that you cannot have a working democracy where you close down debate. Democracy is all about the permanent shifting of tectonic plates. It goes on every day, every second, all the time. Just because somebody is defeated on one matter does not mean that they then have to give up. They can keep going at it, and heaven knows we've watched in this House members do just that. And so in the same way, to argue that the referendum result imposes a permanency which cannot be challenged is, in my judgment, entirely wrong. And when I look at the mess into which we've got ourselves, it does appear to me to be, at least in part, the consequence of pushing this argument and thereby preventing democratic process working. So when, in just a minute, so when we get the criticism that this House is not functioning properly or that democracy isn't working, I actually think this House has an exceptional capacity to reach sensible outcomes. I have to say to my honourable friends and right honourable friends on the front bench, it has been consistently and is being prevented from doing its ordinary job by the straitjacket that has been imposed on the extent of what is acceptable to debate. And I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Learned friend for giving way, and would he agree with me, just as our activities in this place are as such a crucial part of democracy, so are marches that go to the heart of our democracy on the street with 1 million people, or indeed 5.5 million people signing a petition. They're all part of our democracy and they should all be treated with respect.
Indeed, particularly when anybody who participated, as I did, in Saturday's march will have seen people who were optimistic, tolerant and filled with good humour and benevolence, even towards those with whom they disagreed. It was very, very noticeable. And if I may say, I contrast that with some of the rabidity of the comments, of which I have been on the receiving end, from those who write to me and insist that by some extraordinary way, the referendum has closed down areas of debate and made them illegitimate. And I do think this is something which my honourable friends on the front bench really need to ponder when they consider why things aren't working properly for us at present. Now, it's for that reason, Mr. Speaker, and I don't want to take up the House's time, that I've supported the efforts of my right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset, and worked with him and others on Amendment A. Because seeing that the government has run into the sand and had its deal rejected, we have got to find some alternative. Now, I recognise that my right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset, and myself may differ in part on that alternative, but where we don't differ is in our willingness to have an open debate. And I was greatly helped by the way he approached, in his characteristic and tolerant fashion, the examination of alternatives, just as I was in listening to the spokesman for the opposition in terms of the breadth of the approach that might be adopted. It's quite clear that if we're going to make progress, there should be nothing that is forbidden to be discussed. And it's equally clear that we have got to create an environment in which individuals, members of this House, do not feel that by supporting one option, it means that they're thereby closing the opportunity of expressing a view on another. And I will say no more about process at the moment, except to point out that I think it's most unlikely that on Wednesday, if this motion is passed, we're going to come to a conclusion. It is part of a process. It certainly mustn't be dragged out because we're so short of time. But equally, we've got to take it at a sensible pace. And seeing that we've taken 2.5 years to get ourselves into a complete dead end, it's worth taking a few weeks to ensure that we can get ourselves out of it. And that's what we ought to do. And I am the first to accept that it may be that the outcome isn't my preferred one, which remains that whichever option we take, I happen to believe that the evidence is now very clear that the public would like a final say and an opportunity to express a completely alternative view, which might even be remaining in the EU. And I think it is their right and that we should be aiming to achieve that. But whatever the outcome may be, this, for the first time, offers an opportunity to do it. And if I may say, I do entirely disagree, I'm afraid, with my right honourable and honourable friends on the front bench, that this is some desperate constitutional novelty. It is the House doing its job, and I'm afraid the government has only itself to blame by its intransigence over many months of signals being given right across the House, if on this occasion it has lost the leadership of it to the House itself. It could have had that leadership, and if I may just finish with this request. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, is indeed the leader, the leading minister in this country. She is in post. Would she mind to the variety of options that we are going to discuss and debate, and closes her mind to none of them, that she will find the solution to this problem, and she will find that the House is able to support her. But that needs a change in mindset both by her, I have to say, but also I think by some of my right honourable friend and honourable friends on this side of the House, about getting out of this narrow focus. I said earlier that I found it disgraceful if it is true that the Cabinet minutes reflect putting party political advantage ahead of the national interest. I don't know whether it's true or not, but it's been very widely reported. We have to put the national interest first and listen to what people are saying to us. It seems to me there is a very consistent pattern of wanting to bring this unhappy episode to a conclusion and to want to do it in a way that reflects majority opinion in this country. And we can do that by identifying the options and then putting it back to the public.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. It is a great pleasure to follow the Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman for Beaconsfield. Drawing on the speech of the Right Honourable Gentleman for Mid-Sussex, he reminded us of the prayers that start each day. And I don't know whether the Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman set out with a desire to please, but I think his speech certainly did please many of us here in the House. I rise to support Amendments A and F, moved in what I thought were both really compelling speeches by my right honourable friend, the member for Derby South, and in this context, my right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset. We need to remember, however, that we are here today having this opportunity to debate these two amendments for two reasons and two reasons only. The first is that the government's deal was defeated for a second time. We are discussing a motion in neutral terms today, and we wouldn't have had that chance had it not been for the effort of the Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman and many other people last summer. And secondly, because the European Union decided to give us an additional 2 weeks. But the fundamental problem has not changed, which is the government's inability to get its deal through. Indeed, it is so lacking in confidence about its ability to win a third time that we're not entirely sure whether and when it will bring it back before the House. And what that means is that in 17 days' time, if nothing changes, either we leave with no deal or the government will have to apply for and be granted by the European Union an extension. So the moment of danger has been delayed briefly, but it has not passed. Now, having said that, I was surprisingly encouraged. I will give way just once.
As he describes as the moment of danger, when it therefore be prudent to have in place steps that mean we'd be revoking and not going headlong over the cliff, because the European Union has given its deal, has given its options, been rejected twice. We're now facing the battle of no deal. Further extension is probably unlikely. We have to get our heads around it. Revokes coming down the line. We've got to decide over it quickly.
Well, I hear the argument that the honourable gentleman makes, but for the reasons I was just about to advance, I do think the Prime Minister made a very, very significant statement today, which has been drawn attention to by many others, when she said, and it bears repeating every time, unless this House agrees to it, no deal. Didn't want to acknowledge it in her statement today. The inevitable consequence of that binding and solemn commitment is that she will, unless she gets her deal through, have to apply for an extension prior to the 12th of April. Now, turning to the Amendment A, why is it here? Because the government's deal's been defeated twice, because no deal has been defeated twice, because the Prime Minister said twice and more. We know what Parliament's against, what is Parliament for, and the purpose of Amendment A is extremely simple. It is to give us the chance to show what we might be in favour of. And if the government was doing its job, then Amendment A would not be necessary. It is because the government is not doing its job, Mr. Speaker, that Amendment A is required. And if I may say so, the Minister for the Cabinet Office, who is a very charming man, his arguments at the beginning against the amendment were frankly hopelessly confused. Because if I may summarise, they're opposed to the amendment, but they want there to be a process. If the amendment is defeated, then they promise there will be their own process, but that appears to consist of a debate later in the week, and then something later on, the precise form of which we do not yet know. They seem to want Parliament to agree on something, but they cannot promise to accept any consensus that might emerge out of this process, and they castigate us for not having reached an agreement, but oppose the very proposal tonight that is trying to enable us to do precisely that. It is frankly absurd, and if I also may say so in his absence, I don't really think that the Minister for the Cabinet Office's heart was really in the argument tonight, because the government in effect seems to be saying, well, if it passes, we'll get on with it. So let us break out of the circular argument. I thought my right honourable friend, the member for Holborn Bankrest South, expressed it brilliantly, and get on with it. And I simply want to say, I would encourage every member who has a proposition that is realistic to put it forward if the amendment is carried on Wednesday. The Brexit Select Committee, in its report it published the very day after the first defeat of the government's plan, set out what the broad options are. This is not about the withdrawal agreement, because the Prime Minister could not have been clearer today in her statement when she said everyone should be absolutely clear that changing the withdrawal agreement is simply not an option. This is about the political declaration. And on the suggestion, because there was an exchange across the chamber, that the withdrawal agreement alone might somehow be passed this week, not the political declaration but the withdrawal agreement, there is a fundamental flaw in that suggestion. If that were to happen and the EU were to respond by saying, you have passed the withdrawal agreement alone this week, OK, we'll give you to the 22nd of May, what would happen if we then asked the EU in the week leading up to the 22nd, can we have a bit more time? The EU would say to us, oh, but no, you can't, because you didn't take part in the European elections. So as a way out of this crisis, I'm afraid that proposition of a separate vote on the withdrawal agreement falls at the first hurdle. When we come to Wednesday and our pink slips are distributed, I'm looking forward to voting aye to remaining in a customs union with the European Union. I'm looking forward to voting aye to a Norway plus type arrangement which could embrace Common Market 2.0. I am looking forward to voting aye to a confirmatory referendum. And other members in the House maybe look forward to voting for the things that they would be prepared to consider. And the final point I want to make, Mr. Speaker, is the word indicative is really important, because this Wednesday it is about indicating a direction of travel that members might be prepared to support. It is not definitive. We may well need to get to that point in the next stage of this process. So it's not the end, it is merely the beginning. It is long overdue, and I hope the House tonight will enable that to happen by carrying Amendment A.
Order. The situation is perfectly manageable, but a significant number of honourable and right honourable members are still seeking to catch my eye. As a guide, though I'm not imposing a time limit, if each member were to speak for approximately 7 minutes, everybody would be accommodated. To speak for significantly longer that would be a notable discourtesy of which I know the honourable gentleman, for one, would most certainly not wish to be guilty. Mr James Cartledge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I feel like it's novel for me not to have a time limit, if I'm honest. So I am used to those strictures, indeed. Though it's a great pleasure to follow the right honourable gentleman, the chairman of the Brexit Select Committee, and he made that very clear point. We've shown what we're against. At some point as a House, we're going to have to show what we are in favour of. And speaking personally, I still think that the best deal on the table is the Prime Minister's deal. It respects the referendum result, which is absolutely critical. And it actually deals with this very complex problem of how on earth a country that has such integrated supply chains with all those thousands of lorries coming through Dover and so on, how you maintain frictionless trade as far as possible and yet take back sovereignty in those key areas, the single market and the customs union, is very, very difficult. But that circle has been squared, as it were, in the Prime Minister's proposal, and I would like to vote for it again. But I have to accept that it may not come back, and that so far it has been defeated very, very heavily indeed. And in my view, whilst procedure is obviously very important today, because obviously with the amendments before us, it's very much about how Parliament brings forward the next stage of this debate. But I don't want to focus on procedure. I think we have to rapidly focus on first principles, the underlying principles of how on earth we're going to deliver on the referendum result. Because the Right Honourable Gentleman for Hogarth and Pangras, the Shadow Brexit Secretary, said that he thought we should look at a second referendum, that we should look at single market plus customs union and so on. But there's one fundamental issue with all of those proposals which would be raised by any of my constituents who voted to leave, and it's an issue we all have to grapple with, and it is free movement. There's two principles I want to focus on: free movement and free trade. And free movement is not an easy one because it forces us to discuss the immigration issue, which we have so far failed to give anything like enough attention to. I'll give way to him shortly. I just want to set out my general proposition here, because I feel very strongly on this subject, because it's been said in justifying a second referendum that the facts have changed since the referendum was held, and that therefore there should be another vote. And we do have to reflect, what is it that's changed that, if it had been known in the referendum campaign in 2016, would have caused a different result? And I would suggest the single fact that, if it had been known in advance, would have had the most impact, whether we like it or not, is the fact that Brexit has directly led to an unprecedented increase in immigration into this country from outside the European Union. I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Honourable Gentleman for giving way. Free movement, of course, a double-sided coin, and he mentioned immigration, but it's also emigration. And a whole load of people, and we've seen them on the television, some people who voted for Brexit and then decided to retire to Spain and are now ruining the day of their rash actions when they followed some of the crasser tabloid newspapers. So please, when we are talking about freedom of movement, remember it's rights that he enjoys, that he's trying to take away, perhaps, from everybody else round about and himself.
I simply make the point that it is fair to say that it does work both ways. And of course, if we end free movement for those coming to this country, there will be an impact on our rights in going to our nearest neighbours. And I suggest, and this is a profound question we all have to ask ourselves in the context of the EU debate, would our country still vote to leave on the basis of concerns about immigration if it knew that the result of ending free movement was that immigration would not decrease, but that we as citizens would face reduced rights in going to other countries in Europe, having to pay charges, having to face visa applications, certainly for work, certainly for reasons other than tourism. And that's why this is such an important point. Let's look at the facts. We know, under the latest figures, net migration into this country from the EU is down to 57,000. Net immigration into this country from outside the EU is up to 261,000. Now, a year ago, the two biggest countries in the list were Poland and Romania. They are now India and China. And that's not, we're not talking Liechtenstein in population terms here, Mr. Speaker. This is a serious, serious point, because I remember the referendum campaign. I took a very active part in it. I did home and away debates with my neighbour, the Honourable Member for Harwich. And anyone who says immigration was not a reason for the vote, yes, there are many people who for many years have believed in leaving the EU for reasons of sovereignty, and I strongly respect that view. It's actually based on a very noble principle of democracy. But I know what swung many people in my constituency who are undecided. I've still got the emails, time and again, house building in the countryside. Why? Because they thought if we left, there wouldn't be immigration. You wouldn't need those houses. It sounds crazy to say it now, but I've got the emails to prove it, and colleagues will know it. Immigration was front and centre of the Leave campaign. We remember Nigel Farage standing in front of a poster of the new Untermensch. And, Mr. Speaker, you know the meaning of that word. It is a very serious meaning. This whole column of people, the implication that if we left, this wouldn't be happening. We know that that campaign played with fire. It opened Pandora's box, and somehow we have to put the lid back on. And so when I raise this, I don't do it happily. I am personally relaxed about immigration to this country because I recognise the huge contribution immigrants have made and will continue to make. But we must now be honest and say to the country that in the coming days, options will come before us in which free movement is back on the table. So what if it is the case, I'll give Wade on Lady in a moment, what if it is the case that actually keeping free movement will enable us to control immigration in future by having the strictest possible rules on immigration from 90% of the world's population? I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
For giving way, and of course I come from a nation that is very positive about the benefits of immigration. In fact, my constituents embrace immigrants in their communities. But the point he's making about immigration from China and India, what he hasn't mentioned is, of course, that these are international students generally who at the end of their degrees leave again. So these students should be taken out of net migration figures.
It's a perfectly fair point, but of course the reason they're in there is many do choose to remain. But it is a perfect. I take the figures as they are. And I remember your time restrictions, so I'll just move on to my second other point on free trade, because the reason that we have this situation with immigration is actually it's a discriminatory system. We allow free movement for EU, not for non-EU. The reason it's discriminatory is because we have a trade deal with the EU called the single market. And I just want to return to the Lancaster House speech, which is, of course, it was in the Lancaster House speech that the red line on the single market was first stated. I want to return to a Lancaster House speech in which she was addressing an audience of business leaders, in which she said, "Just think for a moment what a prospect that is, a single market without barriers, visible or invisible, giving you direct and unhindered access to the purchasing power of over 300 million of the world's wealthiest and most prosperous people, bigger than Japan, bigger than the United States, on your doorstep and with the Channel Tunnel to give you direct access to it. It's not a dream, it's not a vision, it's not some bureaucrat's plan, it's for real, and it's only 5 years away." The Lancaster House speech of Mrs Thatcher in 1988, Mr Speaker, because the single market, there's only 3 MPs left in the House who voted against the Single European Act. One of them is the Honourable Member for Blythe Valley, the other is the Honourable Member for Bolsover, and the third one is the Leader of the Opposition. Because the single market, this is not some socialist conspiracy, I have to tell you, Mr Speaker, it's capitalism and it's free trade, and I believe fundamentally in free trade. And so in the days that come, we will have to look at other issues, we will have to be prepared to flex our red lines, to be blunt, in order to deliver on the referendum result and deliver it in a way that preserves free trade and gives us the best possible deal for our constituents.
Helen Goodman.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Sorry, I wasn't expecting you to call me quite so quickly. I haven't got my notes in order. As a member of the Procedure Committee, obviously I've been thinking about the system for how we were going to vote for about 6 months, because what happened in the autumn was that the then Brexit Secretary came with proposals to change the way we were going to run the meaningful vote. But since Christmas, it's been absolutely evident that we need to have a new system, because the simple binary yes-no choice doesn't work very well in a situation like Brexit when you have multiple options. We ran into problems on House of Lords reform, and the Prime Minister has found similar difficulties in the last 6 months. That's partly because of the way she's handled the situation, but it is also partly because it's very easy with our yes-no approach to build coalitions against things, but quite a lot harder to build consensus and coalitions for options. So, a month ago, the Father of the House and I proposed using preference votes, as we do for select committee chairs. We were probably a bit premature with that idea, and I'm extremely pleased to be able to support the Right Honourable Member for Dorset West tonight. It's absolutely clear that the Prime Minister's brinkmanship has brought us to this self-inflicted crisis, and it's now essential that Parliament takes control and uses a new process. I'm also pleased that the Right Honourable Member for Dorset West has agreed that we should be moving to paper ballots, voting on all the options in parallel, because this will reduce considerably the scope for gamesmanship, which is also bedevilling this process.
Honourable Lady makes a a very good argument. And we were discussing this earlier, and I think Parliament is quite inefficient at making certain decisions, as we're finding out. And just as an analogy, if you sent Parliament off to buy a gin and tonic, the first question would be what sort of gin, what sort of tonic, would there be ice, would there not be ice, would there be lemon or lime? The paralysis from that one decision would be probably something akin to what we've got with Brexit at the moment. So her approach and what she's suggesting makes eminent sense in a Parliament that can't decide any more than yes or no.
Well, I'm very grateful to him, because I was going to go on to say that the benefit of a new system is that it would enable us to find out where the consensus actually lies. It's absolutely obvious that not everyone in this situation is going to get their first choice. But we need to make a distinction between those things which members find, and the public are extremely worried about, find totally unacceptable, like no deal, and those things which, while they may not be a person's first choice, they can live with, they can go along with. And the process that we need to move into needs to institutionalise this. It's obvious also that building consensus is going to be painful, because inevitably it involves compromise. But this is essential on a major national project like Brexit. And it is much better for us to acknowledge these difficulties and take a calmer approach in order to reconcile Parliament and the public than to be driven into a high conflict situation with the rising tone of anger which we're seeing at the moment. Now, the one thing that the Right Honourable Member for Dorset West said, which did surprise me a bit, was that the business motion on how we're going to do this is going to be on the same day in his schema as the first round of indicative votes. I hadn't planned to speak today, but I thought I'd better set out what factors I would like to be taken into account in the drawing up of the process and the design of the system. The first issue, obviously, is the status of the votes. Are they indicative or definitive? Indicative is good because it allows people to feel flexible and more open-minded. On the other hand, we are going to move to definitive at some stage in order to bind the government, because we cannot continue with a situation where the government defies the will of the House. The second point I think we need to be clear about is that this vote may be on paper, but this is not a secret ballot. We want transparency. We want to be accountable to the public and to our constituents. And also, of course, the whips need to be able to do their job as well. So that too requires some transparency. The third issue is how to get on the ballot. Now, I was slightly concerned in the middle of the day when I was hearing that the government were planning to draft up for every other member what their view of other members' options were going to be. That seems to me to be completely inappropriate. And I think that honourable members must be allowed to draft, groups of honourable members must be allowed to say for themselves what their options should be. And I'm appeal to the Speaker to allow more rather than fewer onto any ballot paper if we get to this. The fourth point we need to think about is how to vote, preferences or standard crosses. Now, I think the Right Honourable Member for Dorset West is considering a traditional putting a cross by the side of the option or options that you like rather than preferences. I'm happy that we should embark on this, though I think, as he himself acknowledged, we may need to move to preferences as we go through time. But there are two other things that we need to bear in mind. One is how many votes we're going to have, how many preferences can we expect, can we be allowed to use, 2 or 3. And I would say that I think we need to consider explicitly whether people are going to have, everybody's going to use the same number of preferences, or whether that could be something that people would want to flex. I think my feeling is probably everybody ought to have the same number of votes. And connected to that is how many voting rounds we go through. Now, We know that we've got to do this in a fairly speedy way because we've got the 11th of April deadline coming up. We may need more than one, but we can't have a completely open-ended process going on ad infinitum. We do need to bring it to closure at some point. I think if people think this is highly innovative, they shouldn't be quite so alarmed. We vote on paper regularly. We've done indicative voting before. We've given preferences before. What we're proposing to do on this occasion is bring all these together. And the most important thing, as I can hear the Minister saying, is that we have some speed in this, not just for the political process, but in order to end the uncertainty which businesses up and down the country are facing. To be 3 weeks out, still to have no deal, a soft Brexit or a public vote to remain on the table is shameful. Our international reputation has taken the worst hammering in living memory. The CBI say they've lost confidence in the political process. The TUC have specifically asked us to look for a new parliamentary mechanism. MPs are always telling other people to change and adapt. Now maybe it's time for us to do the same. Confidence in our parliamentary process will only be restored when we show we can, I'm going to stand down in a minute, when we can act constructively and creatively.
Lisa and Andy.
Yeah, I came to this debate as much to listen as to contribute, and I was very glad to follow the member for Bishop Auckland, who, in a very rare way in these debates over the last few years, has actually set out a way in which we might move forwards that may not be comfortable for her, may not all be her preferred option, but shows a willingness to listen and to compromise and to move, which has been pretty absent, if we're honest, from this debate so far. The attitudes out there in the country are hardening. Constituents of mine who told me 3 years ago that they'd voted leave and they were happy to leave on whatever terms Parliament deemed necessary as long as we respected the result, are now telling me daily they want to cut all ties and leave with no deal at all. And constituents who voted to remain, who said that we'd had the debate, that the other side had won fair and square and we just had to get on with it, are now telling me they want to halt this process altogether and remain in the EU. And I have to say that, having spent a lot of time with colleagues trying to find a way through this in here and behind the scenes over the last few weeks, I feel exactly the same thing is happening in Parliament as well. And if we don't start to move, they won't start to move, and there is absolutely no prospect of repairing this country. That's why I very much welcome what the member for West Dorset has done with this amendment today, and particularly the way in which he presented it. He is not seeking to control the outcome of this process. He is not seeking to do, as many colleagues on each extreme of this debate have done for several years, which is to knock out any preferred option that isn't theirs and undermine any of us who are trying to find a solution to this by questioning our good faith and our intentions and our motives. And let me just say this too, that as somebody who represents a constituency where 2/3 of people voted to leave and did so largely in full knowledge of what they were doing and still feel strongly about it, but where 1/3 of people also voted to remain and have every bit as right to a stake in the future of this country as the rest, I have to say that that bad faith is operating on both sides of this debate, that those threats and the abuse are coming from both sides. I and many honourable members face it daily, and to seek to pretend, as some members did just now in this debate, that it only comes from one side is just quite simply not true. It's insulting and it will not stick. And I have to say that I'm very dismayed today about the government's position. I don't think that government ministers understand how little trust there is left. And as we stand here in this chamber right now, according to the lobby, according to journalists who are briefing things out over social media, the government is sitting in closed rooms trying to persuade members of their own side to vote down this amendment in order, in favour of guarantees. We have been here before, Mr. Speaker.
Time and time again, they come to this dispatch box, they tell us they're serious, they tell us they're listening, they tell us that the House must make a decision, and then when we get up and we speak with one voice about what we want, they say, OK, we'll go away and think about it, they make some promises, they pick off members of their own side, and then lo and behold, where are those promises when they most count? They're nowhere to be seen. What is wrong, honestly, given the mess that has been created in this country? What is wrong with giving Parliament the right to consider the options that we want to put forward? We speak for very, very different communities in this country, and when you seek to deny us a voice, you're not denying me a voice. Who cares whether I have a voice? You're denying the 75,000 people that I represent in Wigan a voice, and all of the other honourable members besides. And I would say to both front benches, that if we are going to consider those options in good faith, given the very different needs and priorities of those constituencies, there has to be a free vote offered on those options. I understand the discomfort. I've served in the Shadow Cabinet myself. It's not an easy thing to do, but where you have this strength of feeling and these very divergent views and experiences across the country, all of those have to be heard if we're going to find a way through this. And I'll just say to ministers too that trust isn't just now almost entirely absent, the goodwill is almost entirely absent. Last week, I couldn't believe what I was seeing when the Prime Minister took to the steps of Downing Street and tried to pit the people against Parliament. The public follow our lead. When we stand in here using language like betrayal and traitors, is it any surprise that we step outside and find that same language levelled back at us? If she wants to restore goodwill, the first thing she must do is apologise to members of this House, who are all in our very different ways and positions trying to find a way through this in good faith, and she must rule out no deal. We will not believe she is serious about the interests of the country if she doesn't. Why? The Minister is asking me why. Why? Because last week I had a constituent on the phone whose son was in line for a clinical trial that could save his life in the European Union, that doesn't know now whether he would get it. This is a child who has no certainty about what is going to happen next. I have a constituent who's on dialysis who rang me to say she's been told to wait for some disruption in the event of no deal. When I went to the Minister to ask what the advice was, he said, we're doing our best, but we can't make any guarantees. My sister is diabetic and hasn't slept for months because she doesn't know whether she'll be able to access insulin. Now, you can accuse me of scaremongering all you like, but the government's own technical notice cannot tell us what will happen in the event of a no-deal Brexit. What sort of government cannot guarantee access to medicines for its citizens in just a week's time? I will.
To make the point gently to the Honourable Lady that there was a written ministerial statement that did make those guarantees only 3 weeks ago.
Remember that I was here on Monday when we were debating plans to allow pharmacists to limit access to medication in the event of no deal in just a few weeks' time. And you know, I went to my local pharmacist and had a conversation with him a couple of days later, and he'd never heard anything about it. So to pretend that this is a responsible course of action, frankly, it's a disgrace. And he can roll his eyes at me all he likes, but this is an absolute disgrace. They have driven this country to a brink, and they are not learning, and every member sitting in this House right now will look at that minister sitting on that bench and realise that this is a government that is not serious about safeguarding the welfare of its citizens. And I'll just say, I'll finish with this because I know that there are many members who are desperate to speak. In the next stages, if we get to the next stages, if this shabby government somehow manages to cobble together a majority for the withdrawal agreement and get us into the next stages, I would just say to honourable members, look at what you've just witnessed in this House. Do not trust that they are acting with the interests of the whole country in mind. This House has got no guaranteed role in those next stages of negotiations. If we do not insist on that right now, we will not get it. For 4 months I've been talking to the Prime Minister and to members of the government side about giving Parliament the right to set out the terms of the negotiating mandate in the next stages and to guarantee a vote about the future relationship at the end of that process. They have resisted that, and that is why my honourable friend and I, the member for Stoke Central, will be bringing forward an amendment when this meaningful vote materialises, because we have got to have a reset. If we are going to get to the next stages of those discussions, then that discussion has to involve every single part of this House. We cannot allow the Prime Minister, whoever he or she may be by that point, to go off and negotiate away our rights and our freedoms and our protections that have been hard fought for 100 years without any say in what that is. Mr Speaker, this has become a tug of war between two groups of people, actually, that when I speak to them every day in my constituency are quite reasonable people who would like to see this resolved. We are breaking our democracy, and that is why I commend the honourable member, the member for West Dorset, for Amendment A, because he is seeking a way to come together and compromise and find a way through this impasse. And we as a House have to rise to the occasion, because, my God, I have just seen a perfect example from the government benches that they are simply not going to do it.
Richard Burden.
And I also rise to support Amendments A, D and F. And it's a real pleasure to follow my honourable friend for Wigan. She spent a lot of her speech talking about the atmosphere within which this debate is happening. And I'd like to just spend a few moments on that too, because, like others, I've been bombarded in recent weeks with emails and other communications telling me to vote in diametrically opposed directions. Many of them insisting that if I vote a different way to the way they wish, then I will be acting against the will of the people. Now, I mean, I have to say, I haven't had the same level of aggression from all quarters, but some of it has been pretty extreme. I've been compared to a range of bodily parts of both the female and the male variety. Some have called me a traitor. Elbow. Few have gone further than that. One email I read yesterday expressed the hope that Parliament, this place, will be burned to the ground with me and other honourable members in it. Now, I know that several honourable members have received worse than I have, and in far greater quantities than I have. There really is no excuse for those kinds of threats and abuse, and neither I nor other honourable members I know will be intimidated, but we've got to face up to what is happening. Now, toxicity, that kind of toxic atmosphere in politics is not unique to the UK. It's happening in other countries, ultimately, simply because of who they are. And my plea is this, that all of us who have the privilege to speak from public platforms, which can create headlines, need to think carefully about the way we conduct ourselves and the way we frame political debates, so that we do not contribute to creating that atmosphere of toxicity and intolerance which undermines democracy and ultimately can lead to violence. But I think there's a deeper problem here too, that all too often people do feel that political debate happens in this place at a level that doesn't speak to them and that it does bypass their concerns. And they do look aghast at us by what they see about the way we've got ourselves stuck in a logjam over Brexit. Yes, the Prime Minister has made that worse, not better. And her attempt last Wednesday to shift the blame to everyone other than herself was unworthy of her office.
Hear, hear.
But we need to look at ourselves too and understand that too often we do appear to embody the stereotype of an institution that talks to itself and doesn't talk outside. And we need to learn from that, not only in relation to Brexit, but more generally too. So what does that mean in terms of the decisions that we face tonight? Well, first of all, it seems to me that the absolute bottom line for tonight is to ensure that no deal cannot be allowed to happen, and that it cannot be allowed to happen by accident any more than by design. As chair of the all-party motor group in this place, I know that the warnings from BMW, from JLR, from Nissan, Toyota, Vauxhall, Aston Martin, they could not have been clearer. Investment decisions are on hold now. Our reputation in the international community is being trashed before our eyes. And the no-deal Brexit would put the future of the plants of a number of those car manufacturers and many thousands of jobs in jeopardy. And the warnings are there not only from automotive, as my honourable friend said. So the priority has got to be avoiding the nightmare of no deal. And that means agreeing a procedure that isn't so much something that allows us to vote for or against our perfect or worst options. but to do as the Right Honourable Member for West Dorset has urged us to do, to find a way of expressing preferences on ways forward that we can live with. I think the idea of doing that through paper ballots is exactly the right one, because that will allow people to express preferences and express votes for a number of different options. This cannot be a zero-sum game. The objective has got to be to find a centre of gravity through which we can move forward. And I do believe, actually, as we move through that process, and it may well take some time, the Right Honourable Gentleman, Right Honourable Learned Gentleman for Rushcliffe, my honourable friend for Bishop Auckland are right, that probably some kind of preference balloting is likely to be necessary down the line. I suspect if we find that centre of gravity, it will involve doing something and jettisoning some of the Prime Minister's red lines. And there's a question for her there, and the decision she's got to make, that if actually the centre of gravity in this place does find a place that is beyond and different to her red lines, she has got to answer that question. Will she abide by the will of this House, and will she take that forward in negotiations with the European Union? Because unless she is prepared to do this, the sustainable majority that the Right Honourable Gentleman for West Dorset talked about will not be allowed to have its voice. And if it is not allowed to have its voice, then democracy will be the poorer, this House will be the poorer, and the debate around Brexit will be set back. In just a few moments I've got left, I'd just like to say a couple of words about the idea of a second referendum. Because it does seem to me that when 1 million people take to the streets, that's not something we should ignore. In my view, arguing for a final say on any deal finally arrived at, or against the possibility that a referendum or a people's vote are not also aroused in the other directions as well. And the risk of a referendum being conducted in a divisive atmosphere, that is a real risk. It's something that we've got to recognise, that we've got to address. To me, that doesn't mean moving away or rejecting the idea of a second referendum, but it does mean a further indication, a further reminder to us that at least we must approach the coming weeks and months in a way that is clear about the kind of politics that we want to develop in this country. That's clear about this being a process that's about resolving differences, not about exacerbating them. And in a way that shows and demonstrates that our commitment is of one, I'm afraid I'm very short of time, that our commitment is to equality of respect.
Thank you. Martin Doherty-Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was actually taken the earlier part of the debate by the member, I believe, for Mid Somerset, who talked about the diminished place of the UK after Brexit and during the Brexit process. Now, of course, often enough when members on the opposition benches mention that, government benches say we're talking rubbish. But I think the Right Honourable Member for Mid Somerset has some degree of support from his own government in that belief. And even today we saw the naval process starting to unravel, the EU military complex and engagement unravelled by the naval piracy task force moving from the UK to Cadiz. So I think he was very correct about that diminished role. And it was also important today during the defence questions earlier today, Mr. Speaker, that the Department, the Ministry of Defence, couldn't recognise that diminished element in defence and security. But again, I think the Right Honourable Member for Mid Somerset would agree with me that it is diminishing our defence and security element, because the Secretary of State for Defence rightfully has a lot to say about Russia, the Secretary of State rightfully has a lot to say about China, but seems to have very little to say in terms of our future defence and security engagement with our closest ally, and who we will have a land border with, the European Union. I also think about the debate last week. I think it was actually just left their place. The Right Honourable Member for Leeds Central, who gave a clear analysis as to the process so far. And I hope he will forgive me if I say there was maybe only one slight thing that was missing from it, and that was history. Because it then went to the other side of the chamber, where another member seemed to exclude history from their own element in a more robust fashion, and they've also now left their place. I believe it was the Right Honourable member for Beaconsfield, who talked about their utter disgust in some ways with how their government had brought them to this position. I think both members would probably agree, as many members in the House would, that this is nothing new for this place. The civil war at the heart of the Conservative Party is nothing new, especially when it comes to the last 40 years of being members of either the EEC or the EC or the European Union. In many ways, the discourse at the heart of the Conservative and Unionist Party is fundamentally exposed because of what they have done in walking through the doors with the DUP. Now, of course, the DUP are not here to defend themselves, but I think we would all agree that they've played a blinder when it comes to Brexit. Because the history of the Conservative Party, with the ancestors of the DUP, more or less has made the Prime Minister a modern-day Pitt the Younger. And we all know what happened in 1800 with Pitt the Younger and the utter disgrace that unfolded in Unionist history. So if the Conservative and Unionist Party wishes to pin its hopes on doing deals with the DUP, they should learn a lesson from their own political history. It's one, Mr. Speaker, they have clearly forgot. They have no collective or institutional memory of their own history. It's extraordinary to see it unfold before them. And what's more was implicit today, and the Prime Minister keeps coming back to this element of, in the two main parties, both the government and the official opposition, in their manifestos in 2017 to deliver, as the Prime Minister said, Brexit. But what the Prime Minister didn't mention on her manifesto, on their manifesto, was giving a £1 billion bung to the DUP. That was hidden. No, there was nothing about that. No one wanted to talk about it. But that is where they are. And there's another issue gone about the nation. I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, as you know, when I first stood in this House, I made it quite clear I was neither a unionist nor a Home Ruler. I think that's self-explanatory, but I have due regard for both those unionist members and those Home Rulers within this Parliament and their position. So when it comes to a people's vote, for example, I'm utterly delighted to support it. My party has been supportive of it. First Minister was at the march, as well as our leader here in the Parliament. As members have said previously, you can change your mind. Why are so many people affronted by this proposition that people, mature adults, who are able to vote to go to a ballot box can change their mind? I know my country will, and they will be an independent one at that.
And Tom Bray.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I start first of all by saying that sorry seems to be the hardest word for the Prime Minister. After her mini-me Trump act last week, I think it would have been appropriate for her to come to the House today, or indeed last week, to apologise for the words that she used. She's chosen not to do so. I really do regret that. I also regret the fact that clarity doesn't seem to be her strong point. Now, members will have seen in the statement, and others have referred to it this evening, that she stated that unless this House agrees to it, no deal will not happen. That seems to be a fairly clear statement. However, when she spoke earlier in the statement, I intervened on her and asked her if she would give us a categoric assurance that we would be allowed to pass a binding motion that ruled out no deal in this House. And, of course, she wasn't able to answer that positively. So I'm left none the wiser in terms of whether, in fact, she has or has not ruled out no deal. Now, just in relation to the amendments that we have before us today, there are two amendments, Amendments G and E, in support of a people's vote. The first tabled by the Liberal Democrats with the support of the Independent Group, and the second tabled by the Independent Group with the support of the Liberal Democrats. Now, I think it's important to continue to maintain the profile of people's vote, and if only because